She was 24 and cold. No job, no lease, no family room left open to her, just a canvas library tote and $9.73 she had folded inside an old pay envelope. And with that $9 she bought a soap-boiling shed abandoned off Big Hill Road in Madison County, Kentucky, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1967. The north wall leaned badly toward the creek. Rain came through 2 seams in the tin roof. The county had condemned it since 1989 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the bottom of the largest copper vat, beneath a sealed floor of hardened soap that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Lena May Harlan had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had not been waiting in the grand way people speak of when they have clean kitchens, steady paychecks, and a place by the window where the mail comes regular. Her waiting had been lower to the ground than that. It had lived in coat pockets and bus stations, in the loose heel of her only black shoe, in the lint at the bottom of a borrowed purse. It had followed her through factory whistles, unpaid rent notices, and rooms where people spoke around her as if she were a chair they had not decided whether to keep. When Lena was little, the first work she ever trusted was work done by hand. She grew up in the part of eastern Tennessee where the ridges fold one behind another until the evening seems to settle in layers. Her childhood house sat beyond a 2-lane road with no shoulder, on a slope of red dirt where rain drew silver paths through the yard. In summer, Queen Anne's lace leaned into the ditch, and in winter the porch boards held the cold through a person's socks. Her mother, Annette, kept a row of coffee cans under the sink for nails, buttons, bread ties, and any screw whose purpose had been forgotten but might become useful again. Nothing was thrown away quickly, not there. Lena learned the weight of useful things before she learned the names of many useless ones. She knew the sound of split kindling when it was dry enough. She knew how flour changed under a palm when biscuit dough had been handled too long. She knew the smell of rain caught in wool, and the slow blue smoke that came from damp hickory in a stove not yet convinced to draw. By the age of 8, she could peel potatoes without taking half the potato with the skin. By 9, she could mend a pocket inside out. By 10, she knew there were bills her mother put beneath the sugar tin, and bills she left unopened by the lamp. Her father was mostly a framed photograph. His name was Daniel Harlan, though no one used it without softening their voice. He had worked for a logging crew when Lena was too young to remember the shape of his hands, and then he was gone in a road accident during a sleet storm outside Newport. After that, he remained in small, stubborn traces. A belt with a brass buckle hung on a nail in the hall. A chipped shaving mug stayed in the medicine cabinet long after the brush inside it had gone stiff. There was one picture of him holding Lena as an infant, his face bent down toward her as if he were listening to something she had not yet learned to say. Annette never spoke harshly of him. She did not speak much of him at all. That was the first silence Lena inherited. Her mother worked wherever there was work to be had: motel laundry, school cafeteria, seasonal sorting at a fruit packing shed, the night shift at a plastics plant that made cheap storage bins for stores Lena had never entered. Annette had a narrow face that sharpened when money ran thin, and a way of standing at the kitchen sink after midnight. One hip against the cabinet, both hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. She was not unkind. That was the trouble of it. She was a woman worn down by arithmetic, and sometimes arithmetic can make a person look cruel before cruelty has entered the room. On Saturdays, before the second husband and before the factory town took its last breath, Lena belonged to her grandmother. Ruth Ellen Harlan lived 40 minutes away in a white house with a tin roof, 3 walnut trees, and a smokehouse that had not held meat since the Carter administration. She had been born with a patience that seemed older than her body. Her hair was the color of flour, twisted into a knot at the back of her head, and her hands were square-palmed, strong, scarred at the knuckles, smelling always of lye soap, beeswax, and garden soil. She wore house dresses with deep pockets. One pocket held clothespins, the other held peppermint candies wrapped in cloudy cellophane. Every weekend Ruth Ellen taught Lena the old things, not because old things were charming, Ruth Ellen would have disliked that word. She taught them because a woman who knew how to make what she needed could stand a little straighter in a world that kept changing the price of bread. They began in the wash shed behind the house. The shed had plank walls blackened by stove smoke and shelves lined with coffee jars. Some held dried lavender, some held calendula petals. One held shaved scraps from bars that had cracked wrong and would be melted down again. Ruth Ellen made lye soap the way her mother had made it, and the way her mother's mother had made it, though every woman had added some correction in the margin. The ashes had to be hardwood. Hickory if a person could get it, sifted fine and packed into a leaching barrel with straw at the bottom. Rainwater was poured through slowly, not dumped in like feed to hogs. The first run could be too weak, the second sometimes honest, the third often too tired to bother saving. Ruth Ellen kept a floating egg in a teacup to test the strength when she was teaching. Though she told Lena the old women spoke of 1.07 specific gravity long before they owned a hydrometer, they knew because the egg lifted to the size of a nickel showing. They knew because their wrists remembered. Then came the fat, clean-rendered lard from a neighbour's hog, measured not by guesswork but by use. 3 parts lye water to 2 parts fat for the heavy family bars, a lower heat for medicinals, a steadier flame when stirring large, 6 hours if the weather was damp and the pot sulked, less if the mixture came to trace early, leaving a line on the surface when the paddle was drawn through it. Ruth Ellen let Lena stir only after the first dangerous joining, when the fat clouded and went dull, and even then the girl had to wear gloves that swallowed her forearms. The paddle was maple, rubbed smooth by women who had been dead before Lena was born. It moved through the thickening soap with a sound like boots in wet clay. "Do not rush what is changing," Ruth Ellen told her once. She said it on a grey November afternoon when Lena had been tired of stirring and eager to pour, her thin arms aching, her breath fogging in the shed while rain ticked on the tin roof. Ruth Ellen did not scold her. She only took the paddle for one turn around the copper kettle, lifted it, and showed the line that formed and disappeared too soon. "See there," she said. "Not ready." Lena remembered the sentence because it had no ornament. It did not promise that patience would make life fair, or that careful work would always be rewarded. It only told the truth of the pot. Some things were changing before they looked changed. Some things could be ruined by needing them too early. Years later, when people told Lena to hurry up, move on, get over it, be realistic, take what she could get, leave the rest, she would hear Ruth Ellen's voice beneath all of them, low and exact. "Do not rush what is changing." Ruth Ellen died in late March when the pear trees were just beginning to show white. It was not a dramatic death. No storm, no bedside confession, no final reaching hand. She went in her sleep after a day of ordinary labour. There were folded towels on the table, a pot of beans cooling on the stove, and 3 bars of fresh soap curing on brown paper by the pantry window. Lena was 17 then, old enough to stand in the funeral home with both hands crossed in front of her, and young enough to believe that if she looked long enough at her grandmother's face, some instruction might still arrive. After the funeral, the house was emptied with the practical briskness that follows poor people's grief. Cousins came with pickup trucks. A churchwoman took the canned beans, a neighbour bought the pressure cooker. The wash shed, Ruth Ellen's true cathedral, was treated like a cluttered outbuilding by people who had never stood inside it long enough to hear the rain talk on tin. The copper kettle went first, sold to an antiques man from Knoxville who called it primitive. The maple paddle disappeared, perhaps taken, perhaps thrown out with warped boards and rusted screens. The notebooks were worse. Ruth Ellen had kept 3 of them, oilcloth-covered ledgers filled with ratios, weather notes, plant uses, and names of people who needed gentler soap for burns, babies, eczema, poison ivy, old scars. Lena found only 1 page in the trash barrel, torn across the middle, its handwriting smudged where rain had touched it. She dried that half-page beneath her mattress for 2 days. Then Annette's second husband found it. His name was Martin Vale, and he did not enter a room so much as occupy it. He had been a floor supervisor at the cabinet plant before it closed, then assistant manager at the textile place where Annette later got Lena hired. He wore shirts with pressed collars and kept a ring of keys on his belt that made a dry, official sound when he walked. The house changed after Martin came. Not all at once. Houses rarely announce their surrender. First, there were fewer jars beneath the sink. Then Daniel Harlan's belt was moved from the hall nail to a box in the closet. Then Ruth Ellen's chipped mixing bowl was replaced by a glass one from a discount store because Martin said old dishes made the kitchen look poor. The half-page of soap notes offended him in a way Lena did not understand then. He held it between two fingers, standing in the doorway of her room, his mouth arranged in the careful line of a man who preferred correction to anger, because correction sounded more respectable. "This is trash," he said. Lena was sitting on the floor with her work shoes beside her, polishing them for Monday, though no one at the factory cared about shine. She reached for the paper without rising. It was Grandma's. "That does not make it useful." "It is useful to me." Martin looked over the page, though he had no intention of reading it. Then he folded it once, not along any crease Ruth Ellen had made, and put it on her dresser beneath a plastic cup. "I am not having this house become a museum of failure," he said. The next morning it was gone. Lena searched the wastebasket, the kitchen bin, the outside barrel, even the cold ashes at the edge of the garden, where Martin burned papers twice a week. She never found it. Annette watched her from the back door for a minute and then turned away to answer the telephone. That was how many betrayals happened in that house. Not with shouting, with a woman turning away before she had to choose. The years after that became narrow. Lena finished high school on a Thursday and started full-time at Millbrook Textiles the following Monday. The factory sat beside a creek that smelled of dye water in August and rust in February. It made industrial cloth for uniforms, hotel linens, hospital sheets, anything a purchasing department could order by the thousand inside. The air was always linted. Fluorescent lights trembled overhead. The machines beat out a rhythm that entered the bones and stayed there after a person clocked out. By 24, Lena knew how to keep a loom from snarling, how to stack finished rolls without catching her fingers, how to read a supervisor's face before bad news came down the aisle. The bad news came in September. Not as a meeting, not as a letter mailed with dignity, not even as a warning passed quietly to people who had given their shoulders and hearing to the place. It came as a padlock on the side gate and a typed notice taped crookedly to the glass front door. Millbrook Textiles was ceasing operations effective immediately. Final payroll would be reviewed pending liquidation. Human resources inquiries could be directed to a number that rang for 9 days and then stopped ringing. The man who had signed the notice was Carl Whitmer. Carl had managed the plant for 3 years, long enough to learn the names of people who mattered to him and the badge numbers of people who did not. He was not loud. Loudness would have made him easier to dislike. He was tidy, deliberate, and cold in the way of office air after everyone has gone home. His shoes were always clean, his hair always parted exactly. He kept a framed photograph of a lake cabin on his desk and spoke of efficiency as if it were a form of mercy. He owed Lena 3 weeks of wages. He also refused to sign the separation papers that would have allowed her to apply for unemployment before the rent came due. The county office told her they needed documentation. The documentation had to come from management. Management did not answer. Lena went twice to the temporary office. Carl kept in the back of a leased accounting firm in Morristown. The first time, the receptionist said he was in a conference call. The second time, she said he had stepped out. Lena could see his clean shoes beneath the frosted glass wall, still as stones. On October 3, the rent notice became an eviction. It was taped to the door of the room Lena rented behind a converted ranch house near the bus line. The room had 1 window, 1 hot plate, and a closet with a curtain instead of a door. She had kept it orderly because order was one thing poverty could not always take. Her work shirts hung by colour. Her grandmother's peppermint tin held sewing needles on the windowsill. A cracked blue mug served as a vase for dried yarrow she had gathered by the road. The landlord did not shout. He was tired too. He stood in the doorway holding a clipboard against his stomach, tapping the pen once against the metal clip. "I need the room empty by sundown today." 8 words. Lena was holding the blue mug when he said them. One handle had been glued twice. and her thumb found the seam as if it were a pulse. Behind the landlord in the gravel drive, Annette sat in the passenger seat of Martin's truck. Lena had called her the night before and asked whether she could come home for 1 month. 1 month, she had said. Just until the wages came or the papers cleared. Annette had not answered then. Now she had come only to watch. Martin remained behind the wheel, both hands visible at the top of it. Annette's window was half lowered. Her face seemed smaller than Lena remembered. Not harder exactly, but folded inward. Lena carried out 2 boxes, then a trash bag of clothes, then the canvas tote she had once used for library books. The landlord helped with nothing. Martin looked toward the road. Annette kept both hands in her lap. When Lena walked to the truck, the gravel shifted under her soles. "Can I ride with you as far as town?" she asked. Annette opened her mouth. No sound came. Martin leaned across her without looking at Lena. "We cannot take on another problem." Lena looked at her mother then, only at her mother. Annette reached for the window handle and turned it slowly, raising the glass between them. Not all the way, just enough. That was the second silence Lena inherited. By sundown, Lena had placed 1 box at the church donation door, 1 behind the dumpster because she could not carry it, and kept only what fit in the canvas tote: 2 shirts, 1 pair of socks, Ruth Ellen's peppermint tin, a comb, the blue mug wrapped in a sweater, her pay envelope, and a paperback book of Kentucky wildflowers she had bought years before for 50 cents. 6 weeks moved through her after that without asking permission. First came Knoxville, where she slept 2 nights at the Greyhound station until a guard with kind eyes told her the cameras had noticed. He did not threaten her. He only stood near the vending machines and said, "You need to move before morning." He gave her a paper cup of coffee from the employee pot, weak and burned, and turned away while she put 3 packets of sugar in it. She walked to the public library on Church Avenue because libraries still opened their doors to people with nowhere to sit. She washed in the restroom sink with brown paper towels pressed flat in her palm. She read job listings on a computer that logged her out every 30 minutes. She applied to hotel laundry, warehouse sorting, cafeteria prep, night stocking, elder care aid, anything that did not require a car. Some asked for references, some asked for addresses. One asked whether she could begin the next morning at 5, 15 miles outside town, with no bus route. Her money went down in small exact injuries. $9.73 after the last room key was surrendered. $8.21 after peanut butter crackers and a bottle of water. $7.46 after bus fare across town to a hiring office that had closed 2 years earlier, but remained alive online. $6 even after a thrift store scarf when the nights turned wet. $4.88 after a laundromat dryer ate her quarters and returned only heat, no drying. $3.32 after coffee bought so she could sit in a diner booth until the rain slowed. Then came Asheville for 11 days, because someone at the library told her seasonal kitchen work was easier there. She rode a church van part of the way with a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who was transporting donated blankets, and did not ask questions after the first careful ones went unanswered. In Asheville, Lena slept behind a Methodist church where the back steps held a little warmth from the boiler room. She learned which grocery store marked down bread at dusk. She learned that a person could stay almost invisible if she moved before being told. After Asheville, she went north toward Kentucky, not because she had a plan, but because the wildflower book in her tote had opened one night to a page on bloodroot, and the caption mentioned limestone woods near Berea. Ruth Ellen had once spoken of Berea in the same tone other people used for cathedrals. Craftspeople there, she had said, hands that remember, women who still know what wood ash is for. So Lena followed that thin thread. She spent 3 nights in Middlesbrough, one in the vestibule of a closed insurance office where the carpet smelled of damp paper. She spent 4 more in London, Kentucky, under the deep eave of a laundromat that stayed lit all night but locked its doors at 10. A truck driver bought her a bowl of chili at a counter off Interstate 75 and told her his daughter was about her age. He spoke mostly of road construction and fuel prices. When he left, he placed $2 under the napkin without making her receive it by hand. By the time she reached Berea, the trees had gone mostly bare. She entered the public library on a Tuesday afternoon with $1.16. a canvas tote gone soft at the corners, and a cough that had settled behind her ribs. Outside, wind pushed dry leaves along the curb in little scraping waves. Inside, the heat smelled of dust, carpet glue, and old books. She sat first in the local history section because it was far from the children's computers and near a window where late sun came in pale and unclaimed. The Berea Library kept community notices on a corkboard beside the copier. Lena noticed it only because she was waiting for the restroom to empty. There were flyers for piano lessons, a church supper, lost keys, a used freezer, 2 kittens, and a handwritten card offering chair caning by appointment. Near the bottom, held by one green pushpin, was a county liquidation notice printed on yellow paper. Property disposal. Madison County surplus structure. Former soap boiling shed. Big Hill Road vicinity. NO Utilities. NO Warranty. Purchaser responsible for removal or repair. Minimum bid, $9. Bids close Friday at 4 p.m. The words did not brighten. Nothing in the room changed colour. No music rose in the air. A child laughed once from the picture book corner, and the copier made its flat mechanical light. Lena stood before the notice with one hand resting on the strap of her tote, reading each line until the letters stopped being only letters. Former soap boiling shed. She copied the address onto the back of an old receipt with the library's short pencil. The pencil had been sharpened down to a stub and wore tooth marks near the eraser. Her hand shook, not from wonder, but from hunger and from the effort of holding still. At the reference desk, an older librarian with silver earrings looked up. "Can I help you find something, honey?" Lena hesitated. Pride had become thin by then, but not gone. "Do you know where the county office is?" The librarian gave directions slowly, then drew a small map on scrap paper when she saw Lena trying to memorize them. 2 blocks down, left at the courthouse square brick building with the flag, basement entrance for surplus. She paused after drawing the last arrow. "That shed has been empty a long while," she said. "Yes, ma'am. It will need more than sweeping." "Yes, ma'am." The librarian studied her face for one honest second, not pitying, not prying, only seeing enough to become careful. "Take the map," she said. Lena folded it into the pocket of her coat. She did not bid that day. She went first to see whether the place existed in any form a human being could stand inside. The walk took her beyond the tidy storefronts and out toward a road that seemed to lose interest in company. Cars passed with their headlights on, though the afternoon had not fully ended. The air smelled of leaf mold and wood smoke. At a bend where walnut trees gathered over a ditch, she found a rusted chain between 2 posts, and beyond it, the roofline of something low and weathered, set back from the road as if it had stepped away from being noticed. The shed did not welcome her. It stood crooked and grey, with tar paper lifting at one corner and a stone chimney missing teeth. The door had swollen in its frame. A small sign, almost colourless now, hung from one nail and tapped the wall when wind touched it. Lena could make out only 3 words beneath the lichen. Soap. Boiled. Daily. She did not go in. The county chain was there and the sky had begun to lower, and she had learned not to enter what she could not yet claim. Instead, she stood in wet leaves with her hands in her coat pockets and listened. Somewhere behind the building, water moved over stones. Somewhere inside, a loose piece of metal answered the wind. The next morning she returned to the county office and placed her bid. $9. She kept the remaining 73 cents because Ruth Ellen had always said a woman should not empty her hand in front of strangers. The clerk behind the basement counter raised her eyebrows when Lena slid over the form, but she stamped it received and dropped it into a wire basket with 2 other papers. Lena saw the top one well enough to know it was for a retired filing cabinet. The other was for scrap pipe. On Friday at 4:13, the same clerk told her she had won. No one else had bid on the shed. The sentence settled between them without ceremony. Lena signed where she was told to sign. Her name looked too young on the county form, the letters careful and upright, as if they were trying to prove they belonged there. The clerk gave her a receipt, a photocopied warning about structural risk, and a brass key darkened by years of other hands. Outside, the courthouse bell struck the half-hour. Lena stood on the sidewalk with the key closed in her fist and the canvas tote against her hip. Traffic moved around the square. A man in a seed cap carried a paper sack from the pharmacy. 2 women came out of the bakery with white boxes tied in string. Above the courthouse, the sky had the color of pewter, low and steady. She had $1 worth of ownership in her pocket and no roof she trusted. Still, for the first time in 6 weeks, the place she was walking toward could not ask her to leave before sundown. The first bus left Berea before the sun had made up its mind. Lena boarded with the canvas tote held against her ribs and the brass key tied inside the toe of her spare sock, because the pocket of her coat had a torn lining and she had already lost enough things to holes. The driver did not look at her twice. He wore fingerless gloves and kept a paper cup of coffee wedged beside the fare box, and when the doors breathed shut, the whole bus smelled of diesel vinyl seats and the damp wool of people travelling without luggage. The ride was not long by a map, but hunger and cold have a way of stretching distance until every mile has its own weather. The bus took her south and east along roads that bent through fields gone the colour of straw, past barns with metal roofs dulled by frost, past cattle gathered shoulder to shoulder beside frozen troughs. The driver left her near a crossroads where a feed store sign knocked lightly in the wind and a state highway ran on without sympathy. From there she walked. The map the librarian had drawn was folded so many times the pencil lines had begun to fade at the creases. Lena held it flat against her palm whenever she reached a turn, then put it away quickly because the wind came hard across the open places. She had no gloves. She kept her hands in her sleeves until she needed them, then brought them out red and stiff. Cars passed with a hollow rush, lifting dust and leaf fragments from the shoulder. One slowed, then went on. A dog barked from behind a wire fence until her walking carried her out of its concern. By late afternoon she had covered nearly 7 miles, though no sign had told her so. Her knees had taken on a dull ache from the crowned road. The tote had worn a narrow heat into her shoulder. She ate half of the last biscuit a church volunteer had wrapped for her the day before and saved the other half because night was coming and night always had its own appetite. She did not reach the shed before dark. A hay barn stood back from the road behind a gap in the fence, its doors chained but not fully closed. Lena stood at the edge of the ditch for a long while before crossing. Trespass had a sound to it in her mind, a sound like Martin's keys and Carl Whitmer's clean shoes. But the wind was sharpening, and the sky had gone flat and blue-black behind the trees. She slipped through the gap, moved along the shadow of the fence line, and eased herself between the barn doors sideways. Inside, the air held the dry sweetness of hay and the deeper smell of animal heat long gone. The floor was packed dirt, ridged by tractor tires. A few square bales remained stacked against the far wall beneath a loft ladder. She did not climb. She knew enough about neglected ladders and tired rungs. Instead, she settled between the bales where the wind came through thinner, pulled her coat tight, and placed the tote beneath her head. That night the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. She knew because the feed store sign had a digital clock and thermometer bolted beneath it, and when she passed at dusk it had read 31 degrees with a red flicker. By midnight the cold had found her feet. It entered through the soles first, then the ankles, then the knees, patient as water. Lena slept in pieces each time she woke. The barn had changed its breathing. A board ticked. A mouse worked somewhere inside the wall. Far off, a truck. Jake braked down a grade, and then the road returned to silence. Just before dawn, she woke to frost silvering the edge of the barn door. She ate the second half of the biscuit slowly, letting each bite soften before swallowing. Then she stood, brushed hay from her coat, and left the barn as she had found it, without taking anything but the warmth that had kept her alive for one night. By 8. She came into the town by way of a road that seemed to blop. By 8, plick. Berea did not announce itself with any grandeur. It appeared in working increments: a white church with a bell tower, a brick building with painted trim, a row of houses with porch swings stilled by cold. Then came the businesses, plain and particular, each with morning tasks underway. At Boone Creek Feed Seed, a man in a canvas apron dragged sacks of cracked corn from a pallet. At Hargis Hardware, someone was turning the sign from Claude to open. The glass door fogged at the edges. The Blue Plate Cafe had its front windows steamed from breakfast, and the smell of bacon crossed the sidewalk like a hand laid briefly on the shoulder. Miller's Pharmacy kept a green neon mortar and pestle in the window, not yet lit, and next door a shop called Thread and Thimble displayed quilts folded in quiet colours behind glass. There was also a bank, a barber pole moving lazily though no customer sat in the chair, and a used bookstore with a crate of paperbacks set outside under an awning. Lena noticed everything the way a hungry person notices not only food, but the rooms where people have reason to stay. The county clerk's office sat in a brick annex behind the courthouse. The entrance was down 4 concrete steps, salted white at the corners. A handrail ran along the wall, cold enough to sting. Inside, the basement hallway smelled of floor wax, damp records, and warm toner from a copier working somewhere out of sight. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A framed map of Madison County hung beside a bulletin board crowded with tax deadlines, livestock notices, and a faded poster about historic preservation grants that had expired 4 years earlier. At the end of the hallway was a counter with a sliding glass window. Behind it, filing cabinets stood in rows, every drawer labelled in black marker and yellowed tape. A woman sat at a metal desk beneath a banker's lamp, writing in a ledger by hand, though a computer monitor glowed beside her. She looked to be in her late 60s, with narrow shoulders, a high collar, and silver hair pinned so neatly it seemed the work of both habit and discipline. Her glasses hung from a beaded chain against a dark cardigan. On the counter before her sat a nameplate with brass letters dulled by use. MRS. Evelyn Price. County Clerk. The same woman who had taken Lena's bid looked up over the rims of her glasses. "You came for the deed?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Price did not reach for the papers at once. She regarded Lena for a measured moment, not as one examines a stranger for weakness, but as one listens for a crack in a teacup before pouring hot water. "You walked here?" "Yes, ma'am." "From town?" "Partly from town." "That is not an answer, but it will do." She opened a drawer, removed a folder held closed by red string, and laid it on the counter. The folder had a county number stamped across the tab, and the words "Surplus Structure" written in blue ink. Mrs. Price untied the string slowly. "You understand," she said, "this is not a residence by county approval." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there are no utilities attached to the structure." "Yes, ma'am." "No running water." "Yes, ma'am." "No electric meter." "Yes, ma'am." "No septic permit on record." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Price lifted one page and tapped it with the end of her pen. "You understand the roof is compromised, the chimney has not been inspected, and the floor may not bear weight in the rear room." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county will not repair, tow, brace, insure, heat, clean, empty, or defend the structure against weather, animals, trespassers, or gravity." Lena looked at the paper, then at the woman. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk held her gaze a little longer. A clock ticked from somewhere above the cabinets. "And you understand," Mrs. Price said, softer now, "that once this is recorded, the responsibility is yours." Lena's hands were cold around the edge of the counter. The brass key seemed to press against her ankle inside the spare sock, hard as a second bone. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Price did not sigh. She turned the deed toward her and checked each line with the care of a person who believed errors were a kind of disrespect. She asked Lena to sign in 3 places and initial beside 2 warnings. Lena wrote her name slowly. Ink caught once where the paper was fibrous. The clerk sanded the wet signature with a little shaker, just as if the year had stepped backward for the sake of ceremony. Then she reached for a brass stamp. It stood at the corner of the desk, black-handled, heavy, with the county seal worn smooth on the edges. Mrs. Price slid the deed beneath it, aligned the page by touch, and brought the handle down. The sound was not loud, but it had the authority of a door closing behind one life and opening before another. She lifted the page, inspected the embossed circle, and pressed a red recording sticker beneath it. "There," she said, "filed." She placed the deed in a plain manila envelope, then took a separate slip of paper from a drawer and began writing directions. "Out past Big Hill Road, but not all the way to the College Forest turnoff. You will pass the feed mill, then a white house with blue shutters, then a cattle guard nobody uses anymore. There is a walnut stand after that. The county chain is yours to remove, though I doubt you have cutters." "No, ma'am. Hargis Hardware rents bolt cutters by the day. They may ask for deposit." Lena said nothing. The clerk looked at her coat, at the worn tote, at the careful stillness of a young woman trying not to make need visible. Mrs. Price opened another drawer and removed a ring with 2 smaller keys. "The padlock belongs to the county," she said. "You may return it when you can." She slid one key across the counter. Lena touched it with 2 fingers. "Thank you." Mrs. Price nodded, but her eyes had moved to the deed again. Not to the county number, not to the warning stamps, to the surname, written in Lena's own hand. "Harlan," she said. Lena looked up. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk's face changed so slightly that a hurried person would have missed it. Her mouth softened at one corner. She sat back, the chair giving a faint complaint beneath her. "Any relation to Ruth Ellen Harlan?" The name crossed the counter like warm air from a stove. Lena did not answer immediately. She had gone 6 weeks hearing her own name only from clerks, guards, receptionists, and strangers who needed it written on forms. To hear her grandmother's name in that basement office, among tax notices and record drawers, made the room feel suddenly deeper than it had been. She was my grandmother. Mrs. Price removed her glasses and set them on the ledger. "I bought soap from her for 22 years. Lena's fingers closed around the county key. "You knew her." "Everybody with sense knew her soap." Mrs. Price gave a small dry smile. "There and gone. Calendula for my husband's hands. Pine tar for my brother's back when the mines had him broken out. Plain lye bars for laundry. She wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with cotton string. Never a crooked knot." Lena lowered her eyes because the brightness behind them had no place in a clerk's office. "She taught me some," she said. "I expect she did more than some." Mrs. Price reached beneath the counter and brought out a narrow envelope, the sort used for cash receipts. She opened it, removed a $1 bill, flattened it on the counter with her palm, and slid it toward Lena. "This was paid to the county yesterday for a copy request that the man did not collect. It has to stay in my drawer until I balance the week. But after 5 o'clock, unclaimed cash goes in miscellaneous fees unless somebody has a rightful reason." "I do not have a rightful reason." "No," Mrs. Price said, "you do not." She put the dollar back in the envelope and closed the drawer. Then she took a different item from the top of her desk, a peppermint candy wrapped in cloudy cellophane, and placed it beside the deed. "This is not county property." Lena stood very still. Mrs. Price put her glasses back on. "You take care going up that road. The ditch runs deep after rain." Outside, the morning had warmed only by a few degrees. Lena stopped first at Hargis Hardware, where the front door opened under a string of sleigh bells left from some winter long past. The store was narrow, deeper than it looked from outside, with wooden floors worn to a satin dip near the counter. It smelled of linseed oil, seed potatoes, kerosene, and metal. A wall of drawers behind the register held screws by size, each label written in black grease pencil. She asked about bolt cutters and was told the deposit was $20. She thanked the man and left without explaining. At Boone Creek Feed Seed, she stood outside long enough to study the shape of the road beyond town. A delivery truck backed to the loading door. A boy in a flannel jacket tossed empty burlap sacks into a bin. Across the street, smoke lifted from the cafe chimney and flattened under the low sky. Lena had not eaten since the biscuit in the barn, but she did not go inside. Hunger had become familiar enough to walk beside her without speaking. The walk to the property began at the square and moved outward, past the last steady sidewalks, past houses with laundry rooms and dogs and woodpiles covered in blue tarps. Big Hill Road rose and dipped with the land. The shoulder narrowed. The houses set themselves farther apart. She passed a white farmhouse with blue shutters, just as Mrs. Price had said. An elderly man stood on the porch in a brown coat, feeding cats from a pie tin. He lifted 2 fingers from the railing. Lena lifted her hand in return. Beyond the cattle guard, the road changed. It became less county maintenance and more memory. Gravel showed through the asphalt at the edges. The ditch deepened and filled with brown leaves matted by rain. Walnut trees leaned from both sides, their bare limbs meeting overhead in a loose dark seam. A black dog came out from behind a mailbox and followed her for a quarter-mile at a distance of 10 paces, silent, except for the click of its nails when it crossed patches of exposed stone. It was a rangy animal with 1 white foot, and the grave face of a creature that had seen human business before, and found most of it temporary. "Go on home," Lena said. The dog paused, considered her, and continued following. She reached the rusted chain just before noon. It hung between 2 limestone posts veined with moss, the county padlock dark with weather. Lena fitted Mrs. Price's key into it. At first it would not turn. She worked it gently, not forcing, remembering Ruth Ellen loosening stuck jar lids beneath warm water and patience. The lock gave at last with a small, tired click. She slipped the chain from one post and lowered it carefully into the leaves. The dog sat in the road and watched. The lane beyond the chain was more suggestion than path. Grass had grown through the gravel. Blackberry canes reached across at ankle height, catching the hem of her coat. She moved slowly, pushing branches aside, feeling the ground before trusting it. The shed stood at the end of the lane in a shallow basin of land bordered by walnut sycamore and a creek narrow enough to cross with one careful step if the stones were dry. In daylight, it was both worse and more honest than it had appeared at dusk. The building measured perhaps 18 feet by 26, with a lower rear lean-to added at some later date by hands less patient than the first builders. The front wall was hand-hewn poplar plank, weathered to grey and silver, each board wide enough to show the tree it had come from. The corners were joined not with modern trim, but with rough battens pegged in place. The roof was corrugated tin, rusting along 2 seams, patched once with tar that had dried and cracked like burned sugar. On the east side, a fieldstone chimney rose from a stone hearth wall, its top course uneven where bricks had spalled and fallen into the weeds. There were 2 windows in front, one boarded from inside, the other glazed with a pane so bubbled and wavy it turned the interior light into water. The door was thick, vertical plank hung on strap hinges shaped by a blacksmith who had not been paid by the hour. Above it, the sign swung from a single hook. Soap boiled daily. The remaining letters had survived under lichen, smoke and weather, plain as a vow almost forgotten. Lena stood at the threshold without touching the door. The shed had a smell even before it opened. Cold ashes, wet wood, mineral damp from the creek, and beneath that something faintly clean, not floral, not sweet, but alkaline and severe. It was the ghost of work, not perfume, not rot, work. She tried the brass key. It entered halfway and stopped. She withdrew it, blew into the lock, tried again. The key turned with a sound like grit under a boot heel. The door stuck at the bottom. Lena put her shoulder to it and pushed. Wood groaned. Something inside scraped. Then the door opened inward, 6 inches, 12, enough for the stale air to come out and meet the living day. She waited before entering. Ruth Ellen had taught her that closed places should be allowed to breathe first. Canning jars, smokehouses, root cellars, rooms after sickness. A person did not charge into air that had been keeping its own company for years. Lena stood on the stone step with the dog behind her in the lane and watched dust drift in the line of light. When she crossed the threshold, the floor answered beneath her. One plank dipped near the door, then held. She shifted her weight carefully. The front room was modest and dark, lit by the one wavy pane, and by narrow cracks between boards where daylight entered like fine thread. To her left stood a wooden counter, scarred by knives and stained with rings from moulds set down hot. Along the wall were shelves bowed under glass jars, most empty, some holding grey crumbs of dried herbs. A ledger hook remained near the counter, but no ledger hung from it. Pegs lined the opposite wall. Two held aprons hardened nearly flat by dust and age. One held a coil of rope, one held nothing but a darker outline where a tool had lived so long the wall had remembered its shape. The smell strengthened as she moved in. Lye ash, fat rendered clean and then transformed, dried lavender beneath mouse droppings, iron rust, old paper, cold stone. The front room had been the selling room, she understood, or the receiving room, the place where neighbours came to ask for what they needed and did not always have cash to pay. The counter bore marks from coins, jars, elbows, perhaps babies set down while mothers searched purses. Lena ran one finger along the edge and felt a groove worn by years of hands leaning in. Beyond the front room, a doorway without a door opened into the workroom. There the air changed. It was colder, lower, more mineral. The rear addition held the stone hearth and the copper vats. There were 3 of them set in a row over a long masonry firebox, the largest in the centre. Its rim came nearly to Lena's waist. Even in the dimness she could see the dull green-brown skin of aged copper, the rivets dark as seeds, the curve of the belly descending into the stone setting. 2 smaller kettles flanked it, one tilted slightly where its brick support had settled. Above them, an iron hood gathered toward the chimney throat, blackened by decades of smoke. The floor here was packed stone and brick, not plank. Ash lay in drifts along the hearth mouth. A rusted poker leaned in the corner. Wooden moulds stood stacked beneath a bench, their sides pegged, their interiors lined with old wax paper gone brittle. A cutting wire hung from 2 nails. So did a broad knife with a wooden handle split at the end. Lena did not touch the vats. Not yet. She walked the perimeter first, learning what the building would allow. In the front room, the north wall leaned as the notice had warned, but it had not failed. The tin roof had 2 open seams, both near the rear, where water had darkened the rafters and left pale mineral tracks down the wall. The chimney looked worse from inside, its mortar powdered at the joints, flakes of brick lying in the ash like red crust. The back window had no glass at all, only a board nailed crooked across the opening and a bird's nest tucked above it. When the wind rose, the whole shed made a low sound, not quite complaint, not quite song. By mid-afternoon, Lena had done what could be done without tools. She carried broken branches from the lane and stacked them near the hearth. Though she knew better than to light a fire beneath an unexamined chimney, she swept the front room with a broom she found behind the counter, its straw worn short and uneven. She dragged mouse-chewed papers into one corner, setting aside anything with writing for daylight. She shook dust from one apron and hung it back because it did not belong to her yet, though the deed said otherwise. The dog came only as far as the threshold. It watched her work with its head low, then curled outside on the stone step as if appointed to keep an eye on the road. Toward evening, the cold began to gather indoors. Lena closed the door as far as the swollen frame allowed and wedged a loose brick against it. She found a canvas drop cloth beneath the counter, stiff but usable, and shook it outside until dust rose and vanished in the grey air. She laid it in the front room away from the bad plank near the entrance. For a pillow she used the tote. For warmth she wore both shirts, the scarf and her coat buttoned to the throat. Before dark settled fully, she took the blue mug from the tote and placed it on the counter. It looked almost formal there. Cracked handle, old glue seam, road dust along the rim. She filled it from the water bottle she had refilled at the library that morning and drank half, saving the rest. Then she unwrapped the peppermint candy Mrs. Price had given her and held it on her tongue until it softened at the edges. The taste was clean and sharp and familiar enough to hurt. Night came early inside the shed. The window became first grey, then black. The cracks in the wall lost their threads of light. Without electricity, darkness did not arrive as a switch but as a settling, one layer after another, until the room was made of outlines and remembered shapes. Lena lay on the canvas with her knees drawn up, listening. The creek spoke behind the building, a steady, narrow sound over stone. The tin roof ticked as the temperature fell. Somewhere in the workroom, Water dripped into metal at long intervals. Each drop rang faintly, then disappeared. The dog barked once outside, not in alarm, but as if answering something far away. Lena held the brass key in her fist under the edge of her coat and kept her eyes open until the dark became less strange. She did not pretend the place was safe. The roof could open under weather, the chimney could fall, the north wall could give way in some hard rain and lay the front room open to the creek wind. The county papers had not lied, but neither had the counter beneath her mug, nor the workroom beyond the doorway, nor the kettles waiting in their stone beds with the patience of things made to outlast the people who used them. Near midnight, cold woke her fully. Her feet had gone numb inside her shoes. She sat up, drew the canvas around her shoulders, and breathed into her cupped hands. The room smelled different at night, less of dust and more of copper and dry herbs. She could not see the vats from where she sat, but she knew their shape now, the largest one in the centre. The two smaller ones like witnesses, the iron hood above them black and still. She listened until the fear in her body lowered from panic to watchfulness. Then she did the only thing available. She began naming, silently but with care, what was hers to do first. Find water. Clear the chimney. Seal the back window. Brace the leaning wall. Learn the floor. Do not rush what is changing. The last line came in Ruth Ellen's voice, not as memory exactly, but as a tool laid back into the hand after long absence. Lena lay down again, this time facing the doorway to the workroom. The canvas smelled of dust, her coat smelled of road, her hair smelled faintly of library heat and hay. Above her, the roof let in no stars, only cold. Just before sleep took her, a sound came from the rear room. Not a crash, not an animal. A softer sound brought out by the settling night, metal contracting against stone, a deep muted click from the direction of the largest vat. Lena opened her eyes, but the darkness gave her nothing. She stayed still and listened. After a while the creek resumed its place in the silence, and the shed held around her as if it had been holding its breath for years. The forgotten place had been waiting, and so had she. Morning entered through the cracks before it entered through the window. It came thin and grey, drawing pale lines across the front room floor, touching the edge of the counter, the blue mug, the stiff apron hanging on its peg. Lena woke without knowing at first where her body had ended and the floor had begun. Her shoulder ached from the canvas beneath her. Her knees had locked during the night, and when she straightened them, one of the boards answered with a narrow pop. She stayed still and listened. The shed had a morning language different from its night one. The creek was sharper now, less hidden. A bird scratched somewhere above the back window. Wind found the tin roof and moved along it in a slow hand. The largest vat did not speak again, but its silence had become less empty because she knew now where the sound had come from. She rose carefully, folding the canvas before she did anything else. Order first. Ruth Ellen had believed in that. Even when a place had little, especially then, a person made a square corner, set a cup upright, cleared one surface, and let the mind follow. Lena shook the canvas outside, folded it in thirds, and laid it beneath the counter. She placed the peppermint wrapper in her tote instead of dropping it to the floor. Then she took the water bottle, now almost empty, and stepped out into the cold. Behind the shed, the land sloped to the creek. It was not much wider than a wagon bed, running over flat limestone with small amber leaves caught in the eddies. The bank was slick with clay where deer had gone down to drink. Lena knelt carefully, bracing one hand on a root, and filled the bottle through her scarf to catch the worst grit. She did not trust it for drinking. Not yet, but it could wash her hands. It could rinse the blue mug. It could clean dust from a shelf and soften old dirt where something needed reading. 20 yards beyond the rear wall, half covered by honeysuckle and fallen limbs, she found the well. Its stone ring rose just above the weeds, capped by a round lid made of boards gone soft at the edges. A rusted crank hung on one side, and a frayed rope disappeared into a dark centre through a broken slot. Lena did not lift the lid more than 2 inches. Cold air breathed up from below, wet and deep, carrying the mineral smell of enclosed water. She lowered the lid again with both hands. There would be time to test the well later. There would be time to learn whether it held water or only danger. A little farther back stood the outhouse. It leaned less than the shed, which surprised her, and wore a roof of cedar shakes patched with flattened tin. The door had a moon cut into it near the top, its edges smoothed by weather. Inside, a wasp nest hung empty in one corner. The seatboard was split but steady. A Montgomery Ward catalogue from a year Lena could not read lay swollen on a narrow shelf, its pages fused by damp. She stood there with the door open, looking past it to the walnut trees, and felt again the plain fact of having been left with something both insufficient and real. The first 3 days passed in exact tasks. She learned the floor by foot and by ear. The third board from the door dipped but did not crack. The 2 planks before the counter were trustworthy if she stepped near the joists. The board below the boarded front window gave a soft warning and would not be used. In the workroom the brick floor held except where frost had lifted one corner near the hearth. She marked unsafe places with bits of broken mould and strips of cloth torn from the lining of her coat. She found a metal pail beneath the bench, rusted at the handle but whole enough to carry creek water. She found a cracked enamel basin, 2 bent spoons, a tin of mouse-gnawed labels, a spool of cotton string turned grey with dust. She moved slowly. She did not empty shelves into piles the way people on television did when they wanted transformation by afternoon. Each object was lifted, wiped, judged, and returned or set aside. Nothing was discarded until she understood what it had been. At night she slept in the front room and woke whenever the wind changed. On the second day rain came, not hard. A steady cold rain that showed her the roof's failures better than any inspection could. Water entered at the rear seam and ran along a rafter before dropping into the right-hand kettle. Another leak touched the north wall, darkening it to almost black. Lena placed the metal pail beneath one drip and the enamel basin beneath another. The third leak she could only watch. It fell behind the hearth where the floor was stone and the water spread thinly before finding a crack. On the third morning she went to town. She took the road slowly, carrying the deed folded inside her coat and the county padlock wrapped in a scrap of cloth. The black dog appeared at the walnut stand and followed her halfway, then turned back as if the town belonged to a different authority. Frost still held in the shaded ditch. Her stomach had become a quiet, hollow thing. She had found 3 black walnuts under leaves and cracked them against stone the day before, digging out the meats with a nail, but they had tasted of earth and persistence more than food. Hargis Hardware was warm when she entered, not heated in any modern luxury, but warmed by a black stove near the back, where 2 men stood with coffee in paper cups and spoke softly about a tractor battery. The sleigh bells on the door rang behind her. The floorboards creaked with long use. Shelves rose to the ceiling, carrying mason jars, stove rope, lamp wicks, mouse traps, hinges, roofing felt, seed packets, copper pipe, axe handles, paintbrushes stiff in paper sleeves, and jars of screws whose labels had faded into a private language only the owner could read. The man behind the counter was tall and bent forward slightly at the shoulders, as if years of listening across the counter had shaped him that way. His hair was white and cut close. His eyebrows were dark, making his face seem sterner than his voice. One thumb was missing from the first joint, and when he picked up a pencil, he did so with the easy adaptation of long practice. His shirt was denim, his apron brown canvas, and his name was stitched above the pocket in red thread. Sam Hargis. He looked at Lena, then at the wrapped padlock in her hand. "You got the soap place." "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Price said somebody did." Lena set the padlock on the counter. "She said it belonged to the county." Sam took it, turned it over, and nodded once. "Been on that chain since I had black hair." He placed it beneath the counter, not ceremonially, not casually, but with the care of a man returning an object to its proper place. Then he waited. "I need to clean a chimney," Lena said. "That chimney needs more than cleaning." "Yes, sir." "You had it inspected?" "No, sir." "Then you do not need a fire yet." "No, sir." The 2 men by the stove had gone quiet. Though not rudely, Sam reached under the counter and brought out a yellow legal pad. He wrote chimney at the top in block letters. "You got a brush?" No, sir. Rods? No, sir. Ladder? No, sir. Money? Lena looked at the jars behind him, the drawers, the stove, the neat grey roll of roof flashing. Not enough. Sam did not soften his face. That would have made the moment harder. He only turned the pencil in his fingers and looked toward the front window where a delivery truck was passing. "You understand credit is not charity," he said. "Yes, sir." "You miss a payment, I remember." "Yes, sir." "You buy foolish, I stop writing it down." "Yes, sir." "You ask for what you need, not what would make you feel better." Lena nodded. Sam wrote her name on the pad without asking her to spell it. That told her Mrs. Price had said more than that somebody had bought the place. He opened a drawer and removed a small green booklet with a cracked spine. "Here." The cover read, "Home Repair for Farm Outbuildings, 1949 edition." A hardware company logo sat beneath the title, faded but still proud. Someone had written notes in the margins in pencil, mostly measurements and corrections. "I cannot sell that," Sam said. "Belonged to my father. But you can borrow it." "I do not know when I can bring it back." "Bring it back when it has taught you what it knows." Lena touched the cover with careful fingers. "Thank you. That is not payment." "No, sir." He began listing what she could not avoid. A 6-inch chimney brush, used $4 if she returned it with its wires still honest. 2 fiberglass rods, loaned. Drop cloth, already had one. Dust mask, 59 cents, and he made no room for argument. Work gloves, 1 pair from a bin of mismatched returns, 75 cents. Galvanized bucket, dented, 90 cents. Stiff wire brush, 40 cents. A small cold chisel, used 65. Roofing tar in a half can from a contractor who had bought too much, $1.10. 2 squares of scrap tin. No charge because scrap did not become inventory until someone named it. A roll of stove gasket rope he told her not to use yet, just to have 80 cents written down but not due. He wrote each price in a ledger under her name. When the total reached $9.19, he stopped. "That is enough debt for one morning." "Yes, sir." "You know how to sweep from the top." "No, sir." "Then you will learn from the book, and you will not get on that roof if it is wet." "No, sir." He tore a sheet from the legal pad and drew the chimney in cross-section. Firebox, smoke shelf, flue, cap, if any remained, creosote glaze, fallen brick. Bird nest he labelled each in square writing. "Do not stand under what you are knocking loose. Tie the brush so it cannot drop. Count your rods before and after. If you break mortar with that chisel, you will make tomorrow worse." One of the men by the stove coughed softly. Sam looked at him. "You have something wiser, Wade." The man shook his head. "No." Sam turned back to Lena and slid the supplies across the counter, tying them together with cotton twine. Then he added something not on the list, a small paper sack with 2 apples bruised on one side. "Those are not hardware," he said. Lena did not answer too fast. "No, sir." On the walk back, the supplies pulled at her arms but changed the balance of the world. By noon she had laid everything on the counter in the shed and read the chimney section once all the way through. She read it again with her finger under the lines. Then she went outside and studied the roof from every angle. The tin was dry. The slope was low enough to crawl but too uncertain to trust standing. She found an old orchard ladder behind the shed, half buried in leaves, 1 rung split, another missing. She did not climb it. Instead, she dragged stones and a section of fallen fence rail to the side wall, and made a cautious platform from which she could reach the lower part of the chimney. It took the rest of the afternoon to clear only the top. The cap was gone, the flue was choked with leaves, a collapsed nest, and a mat of black creosote flakes thick as bark. She worked from the side, never leaning her weight where the roof had rusted. The brush scraped downward 6 inches, then stopped. She withdrew it and tried again. The rods flexed. Soot rose in a bitter cloud, coating the dust mask until her own breath warmed her cheeks. Bits of mortar fell inside the chimney and landed below with soft, dead sounds. She came down before dark, as Sam had told her, without telling her twice. The next morning she began from inside. She covered the workroom opening with the canvas drop cloth as best she could, leaving room to move. She knelt at the hearth mouth with the dust mask tied tight and the pail beside her. The firebox was deep and low, built to feed heat beneath all 3 vats. Ash lay thick in the corners, not the powder of last week's fire, but a layered, compacted ash that had known many seasons of damp and drying. She removed it by scoop and by hand, wearing the mismatched gloves. Nails emerged, charcoal, a button, a cracked marble, a strip of bone, perhaps from some animal fat once rendered nearby. Everything went into separate piles. The creosote in the lower throat was worse. It clung to brick in black, glassy ridges, shining where the wire brush struck it. She scraped without haste. The booklet warned that glazed creosote could burn hot enough to split brick and carry fire into a roof. She worked as if the old chimney were an elderly animal that might bite if startled. Brush, scrape, gather, brush, scrape, gather. Every hour she went outside to breathe clear air by the creek, then returned before her courage could cool. It took 7 hours the first day and 5 the second. By the end, her wrists trembled when she lifted the pail. Soot had worked its way beneath the mask and settled in the creases beside her nose. Her hair, when she touched it, felt gritty. The front room had taken on a fine black dust despite the cloth, and she cleaned it with creek water until the basin turned dark 3 times. She did not light a fire that night. Exhaustion could make a person careless, and carelessness in that building would be another kind of debt. On the 3rd day of chimney work, she tested the draft with smoke from twisted paper. She did it the way Sam's diagram had suggested. First she opened the door and the backboard to create air movement. Then she rolled 1 sheet of old blank invoice paper found under the counter, set it in a shallow pan, and lit only the edge with a match from a damp box she had dried near her body. The paper smoked reluctantly. Lena held it near the firebox opening and watched. At first the smoke wandered. Then, slowly, it leaned inward. Not strongly, not confidently, but it moved toward the chimney and disappeared into the cleaned throat. Lena sat back on her heels and watched until the paper had gone to a black curl. She waited another hour before building a real fire. The first fire was no larger than 2 hands cupped together. Dry twigs, shaved curls from a broken mould, a split piece of fallen limb no thicker than her thumb. She lit it and crouched with her face turned away, listening for the wrong sound. Crack, roar, rush, anything that meant the chimney had hidden its trouble. Instead, there was a small pop, then another, then the careful drawing sound of flame finding air. Smoke rose. It entered the hood and went up. Lena fed the fire 1 stick at a time for 20 minutes. The stone warmed slowly, reluctantly, like someone waking from a long illness. When she was sure the smoke would not turn against her, she set the dented bucket near the edge of the hearth and warmed creek water for washing. Then she opened one of Sam's bruised apples with her pocket knife and ate it in thin slices, while the room gathered a heat so modest it was almost imaginary. That evening she made her first hot meal. It was not worthy of the word meal by some people's counting. A handful of oats from the cafe's donation shelf, water, 1 pinch of salt Sam had folded into paper without comment, and the second apple cut small. But it steamed in the blue mug, and Lena held it between both hands while sitting on the floor near the hearth. The oats softened, the apple sweetened the water. The firelight moved against the copper vats, bringing out dull red glints beneath the green-brown age. For the first time the workroom seemed less abandoned than paused. After eating, she began the inventory properly. She used the back of county warning pages because they were already hers and had blank spaces enough. Each object was named, located, and described. Front room first, counter, scarred but level. 3 upper shelves, 2 sound, 1 split at left support, 7 glass jars empty. 2 jars holding dried plant remains unidentified. 4 wooden boxes beneath counter, 1 full of brown paper wrappers, 3 empty. Ledger hook, iron, intact, apron, stiff, apron torn, rope, usable maybe, tin scoop, dented, broken scale, 1 weight missing, blue pencil stub. Workroom, central vat, copper, riveted, set in stone, left kettle, smaller, tilted at southeast brick, right kettle, smaller, drip stain from roof, Long masonry firebox, ash cleared, iron hood, blackened, draft possible, wooden molds, 14 total, 6 cracked, 8 repairable. Cutting frame, wire rusted through, broad knife, handle split, stirring paddles none, strainer frame, mesh gone, render pot, iron, rusted but whole, lard tins empty, ash barrel collapsed, leaching barrel absent. She paused at that word. Absent. A lye soap shed without a leaching barrel was like a church without a door. The barrel might have rotted, been sold, burned, stolen, or used for something else after the work stopped. Still, she wrote its absence carefully, because absence was part of the inventory too. On the second shelf in the rear room she found small paper bundles tied with string, most crumbled when touched, dried lavender perhaps, mullein leaf comfrey, something resinous that might once have been pine tar wrapped in waxed cloth. There were labels on a few, written in faded ink by a hand that leaned right, not Ruth Ellen's hand, older, or simply different. Lena set those aside in a wooden box and covered them with cloth. She saved the vats for last, not because they were least important, but because they were most. The right kettle was empty except for rainwater, leaf bits, and a dead beetle floating legs up. The left kettle held a thin skin of grey residue hardened along its bottom, cracked like dry pond mud. She scraped a corner with the cold chisel and found copper beneath, ordinary residue. Old soap, fat and lye and years turned to mineral crust. The central vat was different. At first it looked like neglect, nothing more. The inside was filled at the bottom with a hard, pale mass, perhaps 3 inches deep, sloping slightly toward one side. It was not loose ash or broken plaster. It was not poured cement. Lena touched it with the chisel point. The surface gave back a dry, high tick. She tapped again. The sound was not the sound of copper beneath. She knew the sound of metal under residue from the smaller kettle. This was duller, layered, almost wooden at the center, and sharper near the rim. She leaned closer. In the oblique light from the doorway she could see faint lines in the hardened mass. Not cracks exactly, but arcs, as if something round had been fitted beneath and sealed over. The soap residue had fossilized around it, yellow-grey and hard as limestone. Lena did not pry. Not yet. She made tea from hot water and one bruised mint leaf she found outside near the creek, though the tea tasted mostly of tin and hope. Then she returned with better order, sound test first. She tapped the vat bottom in a grid, moving from the rim inward, marking changes with chalk made from a soft piece of mortar. Near the outer edge, the chisel made a flat, dead note. At 12 inches in, a hollower knock. At the center, a muted thump with a faint answering vibration below it. Weight test next. She pressed the chisel tip into the residue at the rim and tried to lift a flake. It broke grudgingly, releasing a clean, bitter smell of old soap and ash. Beneath it lay more of the same hardened layer. Near the center, however, the chisel found a seam. Not natural, too regular. She cleared around it with the care of removing dirt from a wound. The seam formed a circle. Not metal, not stone. Cedar. A disc of cedar had been fitted into the bottom of the vat, then sealed beneath soap deliberately poured, packed, or left to harden over it. The wood had darkened but not rotted, protected by lye and dryness. Around its edge, residue had gripped tight as mortar. Lena sat back and looked at it for a long while, her hand resting on the rim of the copper vat. The building seemed to grow quieter around her. Outside, the dog barked once at something in the road, then stopped. She worked the cedar disc free over 2 hours. Not by force. Force would have broken the wood, perhaps whatever lay below. She poured a little warm water around the seam, waited, scraped softened residue with the knife, then dried the edge with cloth so her fingers would not slip. She used the cold chisel only as a wedge, never as a lever against the copper. Inch by inch, the circle loosened. The smell rose stronger now. Cedar, old tallow, dust sealed from air, and something faintly metallic. At last the disc shifted. She lifted it with both hands. Beneath was not the bottom of the vat. It was a compartment, shallow but wide, built into the stone setting below the copper belly and hidden by the false cedar floor. Inside lay oilcloth packages wrapped in layers, packed so tightly they had not moved in decades. Their surfaces were slick with old preservative and powdery at the folds. A tin box sat in the center, black with age. Beside it, wrapped separately in linen, was a leather-bound book, swollen slightly but intact. Lena did not reach in at once. Her first feeling showed only in her breath. It shortened. Then she stood, went outside, washed her hands in creek water, dried them on the least dirty part of her shirt, and returned. She lifted the smallest package first. The oilcloth resisted, then opened with a soft cracking sound. Inside were tools wrapped in muslin, a narrow-bladed trimming knife, its handle worn satin smooth, a soap stamp made of carved wood with a 5-petal mark, a brass hydrometer in a fitted case, the paper scale inside yellowed but readable, and a little pewter spoon blackened at the bowl. Heirloom tools, not valuable in a bank's language perhaps, but exact, careful, kept. The second package held raw material. Books of beeswax wrapped in parchment, dried rosemary tied in bundles, a paper envelope of lavender seed labelled 109048, 2 small corked bottles, one marked wintergreen, one marked pine resin. Their contents had thickened to dark syrup. A folded cloth held wood ash, fine and pale, with a note pinned to it. Last hickory from South Ridge cutting. Do not waste. Lena read the line 3 times. The handwriting was not Ruth Ellen's still. The words had the same discipline. Do not waste. Not because scarcity was noble, but because every useful thing had passed through labor before reaching the hand. The third package was heavier. Inside lay a stack of brown paper labels printed with a name nearly lost to damp. Harlan and Daughters Plain Lye Soap, Berea, Kentucky. Beneath them were invoice slips from drugstores, mercantiles and general stores in 3 states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio. Names appeared in faded ink: Pikeville Apothecary, Mercer Dry Goods, Turner's Medicinals, Redbird General, St. Agnes Hospital laundry account. Some slips bore payment marks, some bore notes in the margin. Send calendula again. Mrs. Bell's boy healing. No perfume for burns. Ship before frost. The leather book came next. Lena set it on the counter in the front room where the light was better. She did not open it fully at first. Old bindings deserved caution. The cover was dark brown cowhide, rubbed at the corners, tied with a thong hardened by age. On the first page, written in dark ink, was a title: Receipts and Accounts. For household, medicinal and trade soaps. Kept at Big Hill Soap Works. Beginning 1901. Under that, in smaller writing, for those who come after, if any do. The pages held formulas, not a few, not the fragments Ruth Ellen had lost to trash and fire, but page after page of measured craft: plantain and oats for rash, pine tar and sulphur for miners, unscented Castile-style bars when olive oil could be got through a Lexington supplier, lard and ash household blocks, lavender wash bars for hotel linen, calendula tallow soap for infants, walnut hull stain soap for mechanics, jewelweed summer soap for poison ivy. There were temperatures in the margins, weather notes, failures, corrections, customer names and warnings written hard enough to dent the page. Never add strong lye to fat too hot. Rainwater after thunder makes poor leach. Stir until trace holds a pencil line. Cut after 48 hours unless air is heavy. Do not sell harsh bars to mothers. Lena turned only 5 pages before closing it again. Not because she lacked hunger for the rest, but because a thing long sealed should not be swallowed whole. She wrapped the book in the cleanest cloth she owned and placed it beside the blue mug. The tin box remained. It was rectangular, about the size of a family Bible, with a hinged lid and 2 small latches gone green at the edges. She set it on the floor near the hearth where the last of the afternoon light could reach it. The latches stuck. She worked them with the tip of the trimming knife and a drop of warm water, then wiped them dry. The first latch opened with a click. The second required both thumbs. Inside was money. Not loose, not careless, not hidden by panic. Bundles wrapped in waxed paper and tied with cotton string, coins in cloth rolls, a little envelope marked silver, a bank sleeve brittle with age, a folded inventory sheet, On top lay a small military medal wrapped in blue cloth, its ribbon faded but whole, with the year 1918 written on a pinned scrap. Lena sat down on the brick floor. She did not touch the money for several minutes. The fire had burned low, one coal broke inward and sent up a brief orange thread. The room held its breath around the tin box, around the copper vat, around the young woman sitting with soot at her wrists and hunger tucked beneath her ribs like a known animal. Counting took nearly 4 hours. She made 3 columns on a county warning sheet: bills, coins, other. She washed her hands twice before beginning and kept the door closed against wind. The bills were older issues, some silver certificates, some Federal Reserve notes, their paper softer than modern money and smelling faintly of linen, dust and metal. There were 20s, 10s, 5s and 1s, stacked in bundles with dates written on slips. 1031, 1934, 1942, 1946, 1950. Some had bank bands from Berea, some from Richmond, one from Knoxville. She counted slowly because speed would have insulted what she was holding. The coin rolls were heavier than expected. Walking Liberty $half, Mercury dimes, Standing Liberty quarters worn almost smooth at the dates, Buffalo nickels with the animals rubbed pale, Indian head cents, a few wheat pennies, and 3 silver dollars wrapped separately in flannel. The small envelope marked silver held 6 dimes blackened at the edges and $1/2 so bright it seemed to have avoided air by force of character. The folded inventory sheet gave numbers, but she counted anyway. Bills $47,680, coins $4,419.63 by face value, though she knew some might be worth more, and did not yet know whether worth mattered. Loose modern-looking change near the bottom perhaps added last, 37 cents. Total face value $52,100 even. The evenness unsettled her more than an odd number would have. Someone had meant it. Someone had counted to the dollar and stopped there, as if placing a stone at the edge of a path for a future foot. The extra cents had belonged to the coin rolls, the accounting of metal, but the intended sum was exact, 52,100. The number sat on the page without explaining itself. The medal she saved for last. It was not large. A victory medal from the Great War, the bronze dulled brown, the rainbow ribbon frayed at the fold. The pinned paper read, Thomas E. Harlan, Meuse Argonne, 1918. Beneath the medal lay a small photograph of a young man in uniform, his face narrow, his eyes steady, one hand resting on the back of a chair, as if posing had been harder than marching. Lena did not know him, but the angle of the jaw held something of her grandmother, or perhaps she only needed it too. At the very bottom of the tin box was a sealed letter. Not an envelope exactly, but heavy paper folded into itself and tied with thread. Wax had once held the fold closed, the seal was cracked but not broken. On the outside, written in the same right-leaning hand as the book, were the words, "To the one who finds this after the work has gone quiet." Lena held the letter under the light and did not open it. The decision came without argument. Her hands were too dirty, though she had washed them. Her mind was too loud. The room had given more than a person could receive in one sitting without becoming careless. Money could be counted in columns, tools could be named, a book could be wrapped, but a letter written for an unknown future required mourning. She returned everything to order. The money went back into the tin box, each bundle placed as it had been, though now recorded in her own hand. The medal remained wrapped in blue cloth. The letter rested on top. She closed the box but did not latch it. The leather book stayed beside her sleeping place, wrapped in cloth. The tools she placed on the counter in a row: trimming knife, stamp, hydrometer, spoon. They looked modest there, 4 quiet witnesses to a trade that had outlived its disappearance. Then she went outside. The night was clear and colder than the one before. Stars had gathered over the walnut limbs in sharp white points. The creek behind the shed moved over stone with a sound that seemed brighter in darkness. Lena walked to the bank and stood with her coat pulled tight, watching the water find its way through leaves, around rock, under a fallen branch, and onward without hurry. She had not cried in the courthouse, she had not cried in the barn, she had not cried when the door opened onto the abandoned room, or when the money lay visible under her hands. Now her breath came unevenly, once, twice, and then settled because the cold required discipline. Across the creek, a field rose toward a line of trees. Beyond that, unseen in the dark, were roads, houses, kitchens, people washing supper dishes, people complaining of bills, people sleeping in beds they did not have to earn again before morning. Lena watched the water and placed one hand flat against her stomach, not as comfort, but as a way of telling her body it was still there. Behind her, the shed stood without lamplight. Inside it waited the tin box, the old book, the unopened letter, the copper vat with its cedar disc leaning against the wall. Nothing had been solved. The roof still leaked, the wall still leaned, the chimney still needed repair beyond sweeping. Hunger would return by morning. Debt sat written under her name at Hargis Hardware, yet the shape of the future had altered by a fraction so deep that she could not measure it. She stayed by the creek until her toes began to ache. Then she went back inside, covered the tin box with the canvas drop cloth, and lay down beside the leather book without opening it again. The fire had become a red eye beneath ash. The room smelled of soot, cedar, copper, and old paper freed from its sealed sleep. Lena closed her eyes. The forgotten place had been waiting, and so had she. Morning made the letter harder to avoid. It lay on top of the tin box where Lena had left it, folded into itself with the cracked wax turned upward, the thread still holding after all the years that had failed to reach it. The first light came through the front window in a wavering sheet, broken by the old glass, and the paper seemed almost warm inside that thin brightness. Dust moved above it. The room was still cold enough for breath to show. Lena washed before touching it. She carried creek water in the dented bucket, warmed a little over the coals she had banked beneath ash, and cleaned her hands with a sliver of soap she had found wrapped in brown paper under the counter. It was brittle, nearly scentless, and worn at one corner by age rather than use. When water touched it, the surface softened and released a plain alkaline smell that entered her like a remembered doorway. She dried her hands on the inside of her second shirt and sat cross-legged on the floor. The handwriting on the outside of the letter had seemed unfamiliar the night before. In daylight it troubled her, not because she knew it, but because her body almost did. The right-leaning letters, the long tail on the Y, the severe crossing of the T, the habit of leaving generous space between words, all of it belonged to the same family of hand as Ruth Ellen's recipes, though not to Ruth Ellen herself. It was an older branch of the same tree. Lena loosened the thread. The wax did not break further. It had already done its breaking in the dark years. She unfolded the paper slowly, along creases it remembered better than she did, and held the first page flat with 2 fingers. My dear one, whoever you are, I do not know your name, and that may be the mercy of this letter. If I knew it, I would be tempted to burden you with hopes that belong only to the living, so I will write to you as the future itself, though you may be only one tired person with cold hands and no certainty. That is enough. Most true inheritances have entered the world through such hands. My name is Eliza May Harlan Whitcomb, daughter of Josephine Harlan, granddaughter of Mercy Tate Harlan, and great-granddaughter of Annabel Reed Tate, who came through the Cumberland Gap in 1826 with a kettle, 2 linen sheets, and a Bible with the births written in the back. Mercy was born near Crab Orchard in 1849 and learned ash leaching from women who did not put their knowledge in books because paper was dear and memory was cheaper. Josephine was born outside Berea in 1874 and began selling laundry bars after the hard winter of 1895, when 3 families on this road had no cash but did have hog fat, ashes, and need. I was born in 1899 in the room behind this shop, while my mother boiled pine tar soap for Mr. Hollis, whose hands had split from quarry lime. I am writing because Dr. Samuel P. Cates of Lexington told me on August 16, 1951, that the growth beneath my ribs would not be cured by mustard plasters, prayer, or stubbornness. He said it kindly. I do not blame him. A clear diagnosis is a hard gift, but a gift still, because it makes a person choose what must be set in order. This trade closed before I did. On October 3, 1949, the last shipment left Big Hill Soap Works for Turner's Medicinals in Portsmouth, Ohio. 24 dozen calendula bars, 12 dozen pine tar, 6 dozen plain household, and 1 wrapped box of unscented baby soap for Mrs. Wilkes, whose daughter could not bear perfume. That same afternoon, the freight company posted notice that small rural pickups would be discontinued unless we paid commercial hauling rates. The drugstores were buying factory soap by then, bright boxes, uniform labels, lower price, no patience required. By Christmas, our orders had become letters of regret. By spring, silence. I have lived with that silence more than 30 years if you count from the first time a customer chose a cheaper bar and looked ashamed while doing it. The world did not mean to be cruel, it was only hurrying. A hurried world will step over a careful thing and call the careful thing obsolete. My husband, Nathaniel Whitcomb, did not return from the Argonne in 1918. My brother Thomas came home with a medal and a cough that never left him, and we buried him in 1923 when the creek was frozen at the edges. My son Daniel served in the last war in Europe and returned, but not to this work. I do not reproach him. Each generation has its own weight to carry, and no mother should chain a child to her kettle. Still, I kept the tools because tools are prayers made solid. I kept the book because knowledge neglected is not knowledge erased. I kept the money because some future person may need the kind of beginning that does not ask permission from a banker. If you have found this, you have opened the central vat. That means you were either curious, desperate, or careful enough to hear a false bottom. Any one of those may save a life. Here is what must be remembered. Hickory ash makes the cleanest lye, but do not use ash from painted wood, treated lumber, coal, or trash fires. Pack the barrel with straw or clean corn husks in the bottom, then ash tamped firm but not hard. Pour rainwater slowly and test the first draw. A proper household lye should stand at 1.07 by the hydrometer, or float a fresh egg with a circle no wider than a nickel showing above the surface. If the lye is too strong, it will bite. If too weak, it will leave the fat lazy and the bar soft. For plain hard soap, use 3 measures lye water to 2 measures clean rendered lard by weight, not by wish. Warm the fat to near 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the lye to no more than 95 before joining, unless the air is below freezing, in which case let the fat stand a little warmer but never hot. Add lye to fat in a slow thread while stirring one direction with a maple paddle. Do not change hands when you grow tired unless the new hand knows the rhythm. Keep the fire steady and low under the kettle. 6 hours is common for a full boil, though damp weather lengthens it. Trace is not the first thickening. Trace is when the paddle leaves a line that holds long enough for you to count 3 honest breaths. Pour into wooden molds lined with cloth or waxed paper, cover against draughts. Cut after 48 hours with a warmed knife or wire, then cure 6 weeks in moving air, not sun. For calendula, add the infused oil late. For pine tar, lower the heat and give it time. For babies, leave out vanity. No color, no scent, no cleverness. The money is not treasure. Do not let it make you foolish. It is stored labor, nothing more. Use it to make a roof hold, a chimney drawer, a door lock, a body eat, and a craft breathe again if you are willing. If you are not willing, then use it to become safe, and carry no shame for that. Safety is wholly enough. Inheritance is not the keeping of objects. It is the consent to be kept by what others cared for before you arrived. A house may outlive its people, but it is not empty if work, grief, patience, and welcome remain inside the walls. I have hidden this because the world was becoming loud, and loud hands take before they understand. I trust the quiet one who had to listen in order to find it. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eliza May Harlan Whitcomb. September 2000, 1951. Lena read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again. The second reading was slower, not because the words had changed, but because they had entered the room differently now that she knew where they were going. The first time they had come toward her like weather. The second time they found the shelves, the vat, the tools on the counter, the blue mug, the ash in the hearth, the north wall leaning toward the creek. They laid themselves over the place until nothing inside it seemed merely abandoned. Her thumb rested on the line about the future person with cold hands. Outside, a truck passed on the road and faded. Lena folded the letter along its original creases. She did not improve them. She did not press new order onto old paper. The thread she wound loosely around the folded pages and tied with one careful knot. Then she placed the letter beside the leather book, not back in the tin, but where morning light could touch it without sun reaching it directly. She sat there until the fire needed tending. Only then did she stand. The letter had mentioned the room behind the shop, the road, the creek, the tools, the work. It had also said nothing accidentally. Lena understood that now. When Eliza May wrote of being born in the room behind this shop, she had written as one placing a hand on a hidden door. Lena took the letter again, opened the first page, and searched for what she had missed because her eyes had been full the first time. There it was, halfway down. Annabel Reed Tate came through the Cumberland Gap with a kettle, 2 linen sheets, and a Bible. Mercy near Crab Orchard. Josephine outside Berea. Eliza in the room behind this shop. 4 generations, each tied to place by work and loss, not by portrait frames or county plaques. Lena traced the names with her finger without touching the ink. Then she remembered another line from the account book, one she had seen only briefly before closing it. Harlan daughters. Not son, not heirs, not company. Daughters. The word stayed with her as she went out the back door. The morning had become bright, though cold still lay in the shaded grass. The black dog was not there, but its tracks marked the mud near the creek. Frost softened where sun reached the walnut roots. Behind the shed, the ground rose slightly before dropping to the water, and beyond the well, half hidden by vines and leaf mould, stood the largest walnut tree on the property. Its trunk divided about 6 feet above the ground into 3 heavy arms, one of which stretched toward the shed like a bent elbow. Lena had passed it before without seeing more than a tree. Now she saw the horseshoe. It had been nailed to the trunk long ago, so long the bark had risen around its edges and begun to swallow the iron. Only the curve showed clearly, dark against the grey bark, with 2 square nails still visible at the lower ends. She stepped closer. Beneath the horseshoe, nearly sealed by growth, were 3 carved marks. A 5-petal stamp, the same shape as the soap stamp from the hidden compartment, the marker mentioned by no map. Lena reached out but did not touch it at once. The walnut's bark was ridged and cold, holding night in its grooves. When her fingertips finally rested on the tree, she felt not revelation but steadiness, the kind that does not announce itself. The horseshoe had been there through all of it. Freight cancellations, closed orders, empty shop, county condemnation, storms, vines, animals nesting under the eaves, papers taped to doors, and a young woman standing beside a creek with nowhere else to go. At the base of the tree, beneath a mat of leaves, something pale showed. She knelt and cleared carefully. It was not a box, only a flat stone, hand-set, with no name carved into it. At its centre was the same 5-petal mark, worn but legible, perhaps a boundary stone, perhaps a marker for an herb bed long gone wild, perhaps the place where ashes from the soap fires had been scattered after cooling. Eliza had not explained everything. That too was a form of trust. Lena gathered 3 fallen walnuts from around the root and set them on the stone. Then she went back inside. The candle was in the second package, tucked beneath the beeswax blocks where she had not noticed it the day before. It was wrapped in linen and tied with thread, a short, thick candle the colour of old cream, hand-dipped and slightly uneven. A paper label lay beneath it. Beeswax from 1891 hive line, dipped 1892, kept for storm or death watch. The candle was nearly 60 years old when Eliza had sealed it away, and far older now. Lena held it across her palm. It smelled faintly of honey, dust, and closed drawers. She had only 3 matches left from the damp box, dried now in the warmth near the hearth. She set the candle in a chipped iron holder found beneath the counter, trimmed the wick with the heirloom knife, and placed it on the workbench beside the letter. The first match broke. The second flared and died before reaching the wick. Lena stood very still with the 3rd match between her fingers. She could have waited. She could have gone to Hargis Hardware and put matches on credit beside gloves and tar. She could have saved this one small flame for evening, but some acts did not belong to efficiency, some belonged to witness. She struck the match along the brick. It caught. She cupped it, brought it to the wick, and waited while the old beeswax considered fire. For a moment there was only smoke. Then the wick took, and a small flame lifted, blue at the base, gold above, steady after one trembling breath. The candle did not brighten the room so much as gather it. Copper, stone, wood, paper, tools, soot, and Lena's hands all entered the same modest circle. She sat with the flame until noon. During that time she thought of the people who had carried her to this floor without knowing the destination. The Knoxville station guard with kind eyes who had told her to move before morning and handed her burned coffee instead of a citation. Mrs. Pruitt in the church van who had asked only enough questions to know when to stop asking. The truck driver off Interstate 75 who spoke of fuel prices while placing $2 under a napkin. The Berea librarian with silver earrings, who drew the map carefully and let Lena keep the pencil stub. Mrs. Price with her nameplate and peppermint candy, who recognized a surname and chose not to make kindness look official. Sam Hargis, who wrote debt in a ledger but sent apples home under the name of hardware. None of them had saved her alone. That was not how saving worked. Lena was beginning to understand. A life did not always turn because one hand reached down from above and lifted it whole. Sometimes it turned because 5 or 6 hands, separated by miles and hours and their own private troubles, each moved one small stone from the path, a paper cup of coffee, a folded map, a peppermint, a borrowed book, 2 apples, a warning spoken without contempt. The world was still hard, but hardness was not the only thing in it. And maybe you know something about that, watching from your own room tonight. Maybe there was a time when one small kindness kept you from giving up before morning, a ride offered without questions, a meal placed in front of you without making you explain your hunger, a teacher who noticed, a neighbor who shoveled your steps, a stranger who spoke to you as if you were still a person when life had made you feel like a problem. If you have one of those memories, write it down in the comments. Not to make a spectacle of pain, and not to praise yourself for surviving it, but to leave a record for someone else who may be listening in the dark. Small kindnesses travel farther than the giver ever sees. Sometimes they arrive years later inside a cold room, beside an old candle when a person most needs proof that the world has not entirely forgotten how to be gentle. Lena did not know whether she would ever tell anyone the whole of what she had found. Not yet. The money remained in the tin box under the counter, counted but not claimed by any plan large enough to trouble it. The medal lay wrapped again in blue cloth. The leather book rested beside the letter, both protected from the draft by an overturned wooden mold. The tools were arranged on the workbench in the order she had unwrapped them: hydrometer, knife, stamp, spoon. Late in the afternoon she took one sheet of county paper and began a new list. Roof. Food. Chimney mortar. Well test. Window glass. Lock. Ask Sam about lime. Ask Mrs. Price about records. Do not spend quickly. She added one more line and then crossed it out, because it seemed both too large and too tender to write. Learn. The candle burned for nearly 3 hours before the flame lowered into a pool of wax. Lena pinched it out with wet fingers, saved the remaining stub, and wrapped it again in the linen, not for death watch, not for storm, for remembering that old light could still take. That night she slept with the heirlooms beside her. Not the money. She placed that farther away beneath the counter, covered and latched, as if distance could keep her from mistaking it for the heart of the matter. Beside her on the folded canvas lay the letter, the book, the soap stamp, and the hydrometer in its little brass case. She kept the trimming knife near the hearth, not as weapon but as tool. The blue mug sat above her on the counter, empty and upright. Rain began after midnight. It touched the roof in patient fingers and found the same seams it had found before. The pail caught one leak. The enamel basin caught another. A third drop struck stone beyond reach at long intervals. Lena woke once, listened and did not rise. The room was dark but not vacant. Every object around her seemed to have been named into company. She drew the coat tighter and turned toward the workroom. The central vat stood open now, its hidden compartment no longer hidden, its cedar disc leaning against the stone like a lid removed from a long-kept silence. The place had given up its secret without becoming empty. That was what surprised her most. The opening had not reduced it, it had deepened it. Before sleep returned, she heard Ruth Ellen's sentence again, but softer this time, folded into Eliza's letter, into Sam's diagram, into the creek moving over stone. Do not rush what is changing. Lena closed her hand around the carved soap stamp and let the rain keep count for her until morning. The first snow came on December 4th. It began before daylight, not in flakes large enough to charm anyone, but in fine hard specks that clicked against the tin roof and gathered slowly in the seams. By noon, 3 inches lay over the walnut roots and along the lane, smoothing the black mud, whitening the rusted chain, softening every broken thing without mending it. The creek ran dark through it all, shouldering past ice at the edges. Lena had known the roof would not wait for spring. Rain had shown her the leaks. Snow explained the weight. It collected in the shallow places of the corrugated tin and settled over the rear seam where rust had eaten through. When afternoon light thinned, she stood in the workroom with the pail under one leak and the enamel basin under another, watching meltwater fall steadily into both. Each drop made a different sound. The pail rang. The basin answered dull. She read the roof chapter in Sam Hargis's repair booklet 3 times. The first reading gave her words: rafters, sheathing, felt, lap, flashing, drip edge. The second gave her warnings: never roof over rot, never trust a dry surface simply because the weather has paused, never place your weight between supports if you do not know what carries you. The third reading gave her a plan modest enough to begin. She measured the shed with cotton string, because she owned no tape long enough, 18 feet across the front wall, 26 feet along the side. The rear lean-to added another 7 feet of low roof with poor pitch and worse judgment. She wrote the numbers twice, then drew the roof from above on a flour sack Sam had given her for kindling. The main roof needed 2 repaired seams, 3 patched holes and 1 sistered rafter where water had softened the wood above the workroom. At Hargis Hardware, she stood by the counter with her figures folded in her hand. Sam checked them without speaking. He turned the flour sack once, looked through his glasses, then reached beneath the register for a carpenter's pencil. "You are short on overlap," he said. "I allowed 3 inches, not in December wind." He changed the lines, adding more felt, more lap, fewer chances for water to find pride in the work. The materials came from leftover stock and odd bundles. 1 partial roll of 30-pound roofing felt, $9.40 written into the ledger. 26 salvaged corrugated tin panels from a tobacco shed repair. Not pretty, but sound where it mattered. 1 5-pound box of 1.5-inch galvanized roofing nails with neoprene washers, $3.25, a half bundle of cedar shims, 40 cents. 2 tubes of roof cement, cracked labels, still usable, $1 each, chalk line, loaned, tin snips loaned, cat's paw loaned, a narrow pry bar with a split handle, loaned with warning. Then Sam went into the back room and returned with a hatchet. It was not large. The handle had gone dark from years of palm oil, and the blade was ground thin, the pole scarred by nail heads. He placed it on the counter between them. "My father's roofing hatchet," he said. Lena looked at it but did not reach. "I cannot take that." "You are not taking it. You are using it." She shook her head once. Sam kept his hand resting on the counter beside the tool. "He roofed half the barns between here and Paint Lick with this. If it sits in my back room until I die, that is not respect." Lena lifted the hatchet, then it balanced close to the head, heavy enough to drive, light enough to answer the wrist. "I will bring it back clean." "You will bring yourself back whole. The hatchet can wait." The skilled elder arrived the next morning without being asked by Lena. His name was Amos Bell, and he had been a roofer for 41 years before his knees made ladders into enemies. He was 78, narrow as a rail with a weathered face, watery blue eyes, and a jaw that moved slowly even when he was not chewing. He drove an aged green pickup that complained up the lane and stopped beside the walnut stand. A black wool cap sat low on his head. In the bed of the truck lay 2 planks, a coil of rope, and a thermos. "Sam said you were fixing foolishness," Amos said. Lena stood in the doorway with soot on one sleeve and the roofing hatchet in her hand. Yes, sir. He looked at the shed, then at the sky, then at her shoes. You got no business on wet tin. No, sir. That roof has no business staying open. No, sir. He nodded as if those two truths were enough introduction. Amos would not take pay. Lena offered because not offering would have been another kind of insult. He looked past her toward the workroom and said, "Pay me by not dying." For 11 days, the roof taught her humility. They did not work fast. They worked when frost lifted and stopped when light went thin. Amos stayed on the ground more often than not, pointing with the handle of his hammer, giving instructions in clipped fragments that expected obedience without flattery. He showed her how to lay planks across supports, so weight spread over more than one rafter. He made her test each board before trusting it. That nail's proud. Lena looked down. Pull it. She pulled it. Again. She set it again. 3 strokes. She learned the sound of a nail properly seated, not the sharp cry of metal crushed, not the soft wobble of a nail still wandering, but a settled note. Amos called it honest. He showed her how to snap a chalk line with one finger holding tension and one hand lifting clean. He showed her how to sister a rafter, not by sentiment but by bearing. Cut the new board to run past the damaged section by at least 2 feet on either side, clamp where possible, nail in a staggered pattern, no split ends, no trust in rot. Wood carries by contact, he said. The sentence stayed with her. On the 5th day, wind came hard and they worked only from inside, fitting the sister rafter beneath the failing one in the rear room. Lena held the board overhead until her shoulders shook. Amos stood on a crate and drove the first nails, because the angle was awkward and he did not trust her exhaustion. Breathe. She breathed. Now hold. She held. By the 7th day, the main seam had been lifted, cleaned, tarred beneath, overlapped, and nailed back with washers. By the 9th, the rear leaned to stop dripping in the pail when snow melted. By the 10th, they patched the place where a branch had punched through tin long before Lena arrived. Amos made her cut the scrap panel herself, slow with the snips following the rib line. Tin remembers a bad cut, he said. On December 15th, the roof held through rain. Not a proud rain, not a storm worthy of county records, just a steady winter rain from a sky the colour of pewter, the sort that tests seams with patience. Lena stood in the workroom beneath the repaired place and waited. The pail remained empty. The basin remained dry. The stone by the hearth darkened only from old damp, not new failure. Amos sat on an upturned crate near the door, drinking coffee from his thermos. "That will do," he said. It was the closest thing to praise he gave. Lena ran one hand over the roofing hatchet's handle before wrapping it for return. Her palm had blistered, hardened, and split near the thumb. The shed smelled of roof cement, wet wool, ash, and sawed wood. Above her, for the first time since she had entered it, the ceiling did not seem to be thinking about surrender. January made the chimney honest. Snow could hide a roof, cold could quiet a wall, but fire revealed masonry the way illness revealed a family. The first week after New Year's, Lena built only cautious flames, no larger than her 2 hands, and watched the smoke, the draw, the joints, the brick faces above the hearth. The chimney did not fail, it warned. Spalling bricks showed near the throat, their faces flaking off in thin red scales. The mortar between the lower courses had gone soft enough to powder under a fingernail. When the fire warmed the inside and the night air held the outside in the 20s, the old stack made faint ticking sounds as heat moved through uneven brick. Once, after a test flame, a pinch of mortar fell into the ash and lay there like grey meal. Sam came out on a Tuesday afternoon with Amos riding beside him. They stood in the workroom while Lena held the lantern. Sam pressed a screwdriver into one joint, turned it, and frowned at the dust that spilled down. Portland would be too hard, he said. Amos grunted. Break the brick around it. What then? Lena asked. Sam pointed to the joint. Hydraulic lime, sand, fire clay near the heat, gentle mix, let the old brick move. Back at the hardware store the chimney list began. 1 small bag natural hydraulic lime, 1 sack sharp mason's sand, fire clay in a torn 25-pound bag left from a stove repair, a tuck-pointing trowel used, a joint raker with 1 bent wheel, mason's brush, bucket spray bottle, burlap scraps for damp curing. The mix for the lower heat area was 1 part hydraulic lime, 2 parts sharp sand, and 1/2 part fire clay by volume. Higher up, where heat lessened, Sam told her to leave out most of the fire clay and keep the mortar softer. "Do not make new work stronger than the old body," he said. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that rarely climbed above freezing. Each morning Lena warmed water just enough that it would not shock the lime, then carried it in the dented bucket. She raked loose joints by hand, never deeper than necessary, stopping when the old mortar still held. She brushed dust from the seams until the brick faces showed their true color beneath soot. She misted the joints before packing mortar in, because dry brick would steal water from the mix and leave it weak. Her bare fingers went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were too clumsy for the tight work, so she used them only to mix, then took them off to press and point. The mortar was cold, gritty, alive in a way cement was not. It resisted haste. If too wet, it slumped. If too dry, it crumbled under the trowel. She learned to listen through the tool, the scrape of sand, the soft press into a joint, the clean cut when the trowel edge removed excess. Amos came most afternoons and said almost nothing. He would stand with his hands in his coat pockets, look at 3 feet of new pointing, and tap 1 joint with the head of his cane. Too full. Lena scraped it back. The next day he tapped another, hollow. She dug it out and packed it again. On the coldest morning, when the thermometer outside Hargis Hardware read 22° Fahrenheit and the creek had ice along both banks, Lena sat on the hearthstone with both hands tucked beneath her arms, waiting for feeling to return, her breath clouded before her face. The chimney rose above her, not beautiful, not restored in any finished sense, but becoming less dangerous 1 joint at a time. She could have stopped for the day. Instead, she worked only on the upper cold joints, where the mortar could be kept wrapped with burlap, and warmed by a lantern placed nearby, careful not to dry it too fast. She moved slowly enough that impatience became useless. Mix, mist, pack, strike, brush, cover, then stand and stamp, feeling back into her feet. By the 3rd week, the chimney had changed colour. Not all at once, not in the way a painted wall changes. The change lived in the lines between bricks, in the absence of powder on the hearth, in the way the stack no longer shed red flakes when wind struck it. The spalled bricks remained scarred. Lena did not replace what could still serve. Sam had said old work deserved repair, not disguise. The test fire came on January 27th. She waited until late afternoon, when the mortar had cured enough and the air outside had gone still. Sam stood near the door. Amos sat on the crate. Lena built the fire herself, dry kindling, 1 split hickory stick, no paper beyond a twist to catch. The flame took low, then rose. Smoke leaned inward, lifted through the hood, and moved up cleanly. No backdraft, no bitter spill into the room, no red dust falling. They watched for half an hour. The chimney drew. Sam nodded once. Amos took off his cap, scratched his head, and put it back on. "Now it is a chimney," he said. That night, Lena cooked beans in the blue mug, and warmed her hands beside a fire large enough to trust, though still not large enough to boast. The heat entered the bricks and stayed. The workroom lost its edge of abandonment. Shadows moved over the copper vats, over the shelves, over Eliza's tools laid in order on the counter. Outside, January tightened around the shed. Inside, smoke went clean. The floors had been waiting under dirt. In the front room, beneath ash dust, mouse trails, water stains, and 6 decades of neglect, the boards were white pine, wide and hand-planed, fastened with rose-head nails that did not sit like factory nails. Their heads were irregular, each one shaped by hammer and heat, small dark flowers in the grain. Lena had stepped over them for weeks without seeing them properly. Work sometimes reveals value only after danger has been made quieter. She did not mean to restore the floor in any polished parlor sense. The shed was not becoming a museum, nor a photograph, nor a place embarrassed by its scars, but splinters had lifted near the doorway. Dirt had hardened in the seams. One plank by the counter had curled at the edge, catching her shoe whenever she carried hot water. If she was to live and work there through winter, the floor had to become sound underfoot. Sam rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. He did not want to. You can ruin pine in 10 minutes. Yes, sir. You hold it still, it digs. Yes, sir. You press down, it bites. Yes, sir. He leaned over the counter. You let the machine float. Your hands guide. They do not punish. She carried the sander back wrapped in a feed sack, along with discs in 3 grits, 80, 120 and 2ET. Sam added a nail set and made her promise to sink every proud rose head before turning the machine on. That took most of the first day. Lena moved board by board, kneeling with the nail set, tapping gently so the old heads lowered without splitting the pine around them. She marked damaged places with chalk and swept twice before beginning. The 80 grit pass was loud enough to shake thoughts loose. The sander hummed through her arms and shoulders, and pine dust rose in a pale cloud despite the collection bag. She worked with the grain, never across it, moving slowly, overlapping each path by half. The first pass removed the hardened grey skin, but left stains, burns, old cuts, and dark places where spilled lye had entered the wood. She did not chase them all. A floor without memory would have been a lie. The 120 grit pass softened the torn places. The boards began to show themselves, winter growth lines close and dark, summer growth wider and golden, knots like watchful eyes, saw marks visible where a plane had skipped. Near the counter a crescent of deeper wear marked where customers or workers had stood for years. Lena left it. Some hollows deserved to remain because they were made by coming and going, not by neglect. The 220 grit pass took patience. By then her back hurt and her hands had gone fine trembled from the machine. She wanted to hurry. She wanted the dust gone, the boards sealed, the room made cleaner before the next cold night, but the last pass was the one the foot would feel. She heard Ruth Ellen in the work. Not ready. Not ready. Not ready. So she moved at the same pace from first board to last. After sanding came cleaning. She swept, then swept again, then wiped with barely damp cloths until the cloths no longer came away grey. The room smelled of raw pine and old soap, the cleanest scent the shed had offered since she entered it. For finish, Sam recommended tung oil cut lightly for the first coat and boiled linseed for later warmth, but warned her about rags heating if balled together. Lay them flat outside, he said, or you burn down what you just saved. The first coat entered the wood like rain entering dry ground. Pale boards darkened to honey, stains deepened, the old ware by the counter turned amber. After 48 hours, she rubbed the surface lightly and applied the second coat, thinner, another 48 hours, then the third. By then the colour had moved from dark honey towards something almost mahogany in the oldest planks, as if the floor had held a deeper warmth all along and needed only permission. The bad morning came between the second and third coats. Lena woke before dawn with her body refusing the argument of duty. Her fingers were swollen from cold and work, her shoulders ached from the roof, the chimney, the sander, the endless carrying of water. The list on the counter had become less a guide than an accusation. Roof finished, chimney drawing, floor curing, windows waiting, well untested, food low, debt rising, spring far away. She put on her coat and walked without tools, past the walnut tree, past the well, beyond the creek where the land dipped into a marshy hollow, edged with sedge and winter grass. The ground there held water under a skim of ice that broke softly beneath her steps. She sat on a fallen log and watched the morning open without asking anything from her. A great blue heron stood at the far edge of the marsh. It was nearly the colour of the weather, long-legged, folded into itself with a patience that made even the trees seem hurried. For 20 minutes it did not move. Then it lifted one foot and placed it down so slowly, Lena felt the movement in her own ankle. It struck once at the water and came up empty. It did not appear ashamed. It simply waited again. Lena did no work that day. She returned at dusk with wet cuffs and an empty stomach, but the sharpness inside her had eased. The floor had not suffered because she had rested. The roof had not opened. The chimney had not forgotten how to draw. The world had not rewarded exhaustion with extra holiness. It had only gone on, quiet and exact. The forgotten place had been waiting, and so had she. On the next morning she finished the third coat. February entered through the windows because the windows allowed it. There were 8 in all, if the rear lean-to openings counted, and by then Lena counted everything that admitted weather. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked with long diagonal breaks that caught dawn in sharp white lines. 1, in the front room beside the counter, was original to the first building, or near enough that Sam told her not to replace it unless it fell into her hands. The pane was wavy, bubbled and faintly green at the edges, held in by old points and glazing hard as bone. "That one stays," Sam said. "Yes, sir." "I mean it." "Yes, sir." He set new panes on the counter wrapped in newspaper, each cut to measured size, not perfect. Glass in old sashes rarely met perfection without argument. He gave her a can of DAP 33 glazing putty, a glazier's knife, a packet of points, and 2 coils of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord for the front windows, whose weight still hid inside the wall pockets. "Warm the putty in your hand," he said. "Do not smear. Bed the glass, points flat. Putty bevel sheds water. Pretty does not matter if rain runs in." Lena began with the 3 empty frames. She removed the brittle remains of old glazing with the trimming knife and a putty knife Sam had sharpened on the belt sander. She worked slowly because the wood was dry and would split if bullied. Each sash came out reluctantly, pins lifted, cords cut or absent, paint broken at the edges in flakes the color of old cream. She laid them on the counter and cleaned the rabbets until bare wood showed. The putty was stiff in February. She warmed each lump between her palms, rolling it until it became obedient. A thin bed first, glass lowered carefully, not pressed at the corners. Glazier's points pushed flat with the knife, 1 at each side, more where the sash had warped, then the outer bevel drawn in one slow line. The first looked poor, the second less so by the third. She understood the angle her wrist needed and the pressure that made the putty seal without tearing. The cracked panes were harder. Broken glass had a threat even when still in place. She taped both sides before removing shards, then lifted them piece by piece into a wooden box. 1 triangular fragment held the reflection of her face divided by a crack, 1 eye in the upper piece, her mouth in the lower. She wrapped it in newspaper before setting it aside. Not everything old deserved keeping. Some things had done their service and needed to leave safely. The sash cords taught another kind of patience. The front windows had counterweights hidden behind narrow access panels. Lena pried the first panel free and found the iron weight lying loose at the bottom of the pocket. The old cord rotted into black threads. Sam's booklet described the repair in plain drawings. Feed the new cord over the pulley. Tee to weight with a figure-8 knot. Set weight back into pocket. Attach cord to sash groove with small brads. Test before closing the wall. Simple on paper. In practice, the first weight slipped from her cold fingers and dropped 6 inches with a thud that brought dust down from inside the wall. She sat back, breathing through her teeth. Then she tried again. The cotton cord was honest under her fingers, braided tight, thick enough to trust. She tied the figure-8 knot 3 times before accepting it. The knot had to be large enough not to pull through, neat enough not to snag, and tight enough to carry seasons. When the sash rose and stayed open for the first time, Lena laughed once. It startled her. The sound was small and cracked from disuse, but it belonged to her, and the room received it without comment. Cold air entered through the open sash, carrying the scent of wet bark and distant wood smoke. She lowered the window, raised it again, and watched the cord move over the pulley with a soft, living sound. The original front pane she saved for last. She did not remove it. She cleaned around it with warm water and cotton cloth, softening dirt rather than scraping. The glass distorted everything beyond it, turning the walnut branches into waves and the road into a grey ribbon underwater. In one corner beneath hardened putty, someone had scratched a tiny mark into the wood, EHW. not large, not meant for display, a maker's or owner's mark, kept where only work would find it. Lena touched the letters once with the back of her finger. By the last week of February, 7 windows held against weather. The 8th, the original, held, because it always had. On the final afternoon she worked on the rear window overlooking the walnut tree. The glass was set, the points driven, the putty beveled with more confidence than beauty. Her hands were white at the creases from glazing compound. The room smelled of linseed oil, cold glass, lime dust and ash. Outside snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground dark and wet under the trees. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch just beyond the new pane. It was very near, no bigger than her fist, with black cap, white cheek and grey back puffed against the cold. It tilted its head and looked through the glass at Lena, as if the house had become interesting again. Then it hopped once along the branch, shook snowmelt from its feet, and flew toward the creek. Lena stood with the glazier's knife in her hand long after it had gone. The window held the light differently now. Not brighter exactly, more carefully. The room was still rough, still unfinished, still full of lists and debt and weather to answer, but wind no longer entered everywhere. It pleased. Rain had to ask harder. Cold had fewer doors. She wiped the knife, closed the putty can, and set the last loose shard of broken glass into the box for disposal. By evening the shed looked out through 8 windows, and for the first time it looked back like a place intending to remain. 2 winters later, the first finished bar came out of the mould on a morning so cold the creek had stopped speaking at its edges. It was December 2024, and the sky over Big Hill Road had the pale, hard look of pewter held too long in a drawer. Frost silvered the walnut roots. The lane was no longer half swallowed by blackberry canes, though it had not become tidy in the way of places made for visitors. Lena had cleared it only wide enough for a person to walk and a truck to come slowly if it needed to. The road still asked attention. She preferred it that way. Inside the shed, the fire had been banked since before dawn. The chimney drew steady now, not as a miracle, but as a structure repaired joint by joint and trusted because it had earned trust. The central copper vat, cleaned over many months with vinegar, salt, soft cloth and restraint, held the dull burnish of old metal brought back without being made new. Its rivets were still dark, its scars remained around. It stood the smaller kettles, the wooden moulds, the cutting frame restrung with new wire, and the maple paddle Sam Hargis had found in an estate box and sold to Lena for $1 because he said no paddle had business becoming decoration. The first bar was plain lye soap. No lavender, no colour, no oil chosen because a catalogue had praised it. Lena had made it from hickory ash leached in a barrel she had built from white oak staves, rainwater collected off the repaired roof, and clean-rendered lard bought from a farmer whose wife remembered Ruth Ellen's name. She had tested the lye with the brass hydrometer from the hidden compartment, watching the line settle at 1.07, and then tested again because old instructions deserved more than admiration. The fat had been warmed to just under 100 degrees. The lye had cooled to 94. She poured slowly, stirring one direction with both hands on the paddle. The first trace had lied. It thickened too soon, then loosened again, and Lena heard Ruth Ellen so clearly she almost turned her head. Do not rush what is changing. So she stayed with the pot. The mixture came honest after the 3rd hour, then deeper after the 5th, holding a line behind the paddle long enough for 3 full breaths. She poured into the mould before dusk, covered it with cloth and did not touch it for 48 hours. Now the time had come to cut. The loaf slid free with the reluctance of something that had not yet decided whether it trusted the world. It was cream-coloured, dense, faintly translucent at the corners. Lena set it on the cutting table beneath the front window. The old wavy glass turned winter light soft across the surface. She warmed the wire, measured by hand and by eye, and drew the first cut down. The bar separated cleanly. She lifted it and held it near her face. It smelled plain, ash, fat, clean work, no apology. She set it on the curing rack. Then she cut the rest. The restored interior around her had not become polished. It had become useful, and that was better. The pine floor held a deep, dark honey beneath years of oil and foot traffic. The front counter had been scrubbed, sanded only where splinters lifted, and rubbed with beeswax until the old knife scars shone in low light. The shelves carried jars, now dried calendula, lavender, ground oats, pine resin, walnut hulls, rosemary, comfrey leaf, and hickory ash labelled by burn date. Above the ledger hook hung a new ledger bound in brown cloth, its first pages filled in Lena's careful writing. The workroom held warmth differently than it once had. The chimney gave heat back after the fire had lowered. The repaired windows trembled in hard wind but did not surrender it. The roof carried snow without dripping into the right-hand kettle. The original front pane still bent the view of the walnut tree, making each branch look as if it were underwater. And Lena had come to love that distortion because it reminded her that clear sight was not the only honest sight. The tin box remained beneath the counter, not hidden exactly, kept. She had used almost none of what it held in the way other people might have expected. She had spent 3 silver dimes at the bank only after having them appraised and exchanged properly, because she needed cash for lime, food, and the first winter's taxes. Later she used one worn $half to pay the cemetery office for a record copy. The rest remained wrapped, listed, and sealed again with her own inventory placed beside Eliza's, not because money was sacred, it was not, but because stored labour should not be scattered just to prove that life had changed. The medal had left the shed only once. On November 11th, 2024, Lena carried Thomas E. Harlan's Victory Medal to Berea Cemetery, where records placed him in a family row beneath a limestone marker gone lichen grey at the base. The morning was cold and bright. Small flags stood beside veterans' graves, their cloth moving in the wind with a sound like pages being turned. Lena had cleaned the medal gently, not to shine away its age, but to remove the dust of secrecy. She laid it on a folded cloth at the foot of the stone and read his name aloud. No one gathered. No one took a photograph. A groundskeeper in a brown jacket paused at a distance, removed his cap, and then went back to clearing leaves from a path. Lena stood until the church bell in town struck 11, then she wrapped the medal again and brought it home. That same autumn the brass key found its lock. It happened because of the walnut tree. For 2 years the key had rested on the mantel, its bow shaped like the 5-petal soap mark, its teeth cut in a pattern no modern lockmaker in town recognized. Sam had turned it in his fingers and said it was old but not ornamental. Mrs. Price had searched courthouse records for mention of a lockbox and found nothing. Lena had tried it on the shed door, the old county padlock, a drawer beneath the counter, the tin box, and a small oak chest Sam had brought from a cousin's barn. Nothing. She did not force it. Some keys wait for their doors. After the first hard frost of 2024, a limb broke from the largest walnut during a night wind. It did not strike the shed. It fell outward, tearing a strip of bark from the trunk just below the old horseshoe. When Lena came out at dawn, she found pale wood exposed beneath the wound, and within that pale place a glint of greened brass. At first she thought it was an old nail. Then she cleared gently with her fingers and saw the edge of a plate set into the trunk, swallowed for decades by living wood. The brass was nearly hidden, but a keyhole remained, narrow and dark, just beneath the curve of the horseshoe. The tree had grown around it without crushing it, or perhaps whoever placed it there had known the tree well enough to leave room for time. Lena brought the mantel key outside. It entered stiffly. She waited, breathed warmth over the lock, and turned it with no more pressure than patience allowed. The mechanism gave with a soft internal click. A small door opened in the tree. Inside was a hollow lined with tin, dry despite the years. There lay a folded 48-star flag, its cotton faded but carefully kept, and beneath it a note wrapped in oilcloth. The paper was dated July 4th, 1919. The handwriting was Eliza's mother's, according to the account book comparisons Mrs. Price later made. To the daughter who keeps the fire after us. This flag covered Nathaniel's coffin when the train brought him home in spirit, though not in body. There was no body for us to receive, only his name, his medal, and the government's folded cloth. I have placed it in the walnut because this tree was young when he planted it, and because sorrow needs a living guardian. Do not display this for pride. Pride is too loud for the dead. Keep it for remembrance. Keep it for the day when someone asks whether ordinary people ever gave everything they had to wars begun far from their kitchens. Tell them yes. Then make something useful with your hands. Because usefulness is one way grief learns to stand. Josephine Harlan, Berea, Kentucky. Lena stood beneath the walnut for a long time with the small door open and the folded flag against her chest. After that, the hollow became part of the place's keeping. She did not remove the flag except to air it once in shade, under the advice of a textile conservator at the college who volunteered an hour and accepted 2 plain bars in thanks. The note she copied by hand and stored with Eliza's letter. The original returned to the tin-lined hollow, wrapped again with a small packet of cedar shavings to discourage insects. The brass key went back to the mantel. Now it had a known silence. The shop reopened without a sign painter, without an announcement, without anyone calling it a reopening. It began with an index card on the corkboard inside the Blue Plate Cafe, written in Lena's hand. Plain, lye, soap, small batch, UN scented, Big Hill Road, orders by mail or cafe pickup. Leave name with Doris. Doris, who owned the cafe and had been leaving paper bags on Lena's doorstep during the first winter, pinned the card at eye level beside a notice for piano tuning. She did not ask whether Lena wanted a larger card. She did not suggest a photograph. She only pressed the pin in with her thumb and said, "That will find who needs it." By the end of 2 months, the list had 43 names. Not customers in the modern sense. Names. Mrs. Price wanted calendula when Lena was ready. Sam wanted plain bars for shop hands who split their knuckles in January. Amos Bell wanted pine tar but said he would wait until Lena had ruined at least 1 test batch in private. A nurse from Richmond left a note asking about unscented soap for her father. Someone from Pikeville wrote after hearing from a cousin. A woman in Ohio sent a money order and a letter describing her grandmother's laundry shelf. Lena answered each one by hand. She sold slowly because the soap cured slowly and because haste had already ruined too much in the world. No one came to interview her. No newspaper discovered the shed. No company offered to buy the name. Once, a woman from an online craft marketplace wrote asking whether Lena could produce 200 bars before Christmas if packaging was provided. Lena read the letter, folded it once, and placed it beneath a stone on the counter until she knew the answer would not be sharpened by pride. Then she wrote back, "No, thank you." The work remained small. In March, Caleb brought the sign. He had first come the winter before as a boy on a Schwinn bicycle with a splitting mole balanced across the handlebars, saying his mother had sent him because she remembered Lena's grandfather. He had not been graceful then. He was 15, all elbows, hunger and pride, and he split firewood as if each log had insulted him personally. When Lena tried to pay him, he shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." That was all. By the time he returned with the sign, he had grown taller but not smoother. He came up the lane after school carrying a long board wrapped in a bedsheet. His bicycle leaned against the walnut tree while he stood in the doorway, suddenly shy of the object in his hands. "It is not professional," he said. Lena wiped her hands on her apron. "Most useful things are not." He laid the board across the counter and unwrapped it. The wood was walnut, dark and close-grained, planed by hand. The letters had been carved with careful unevenness, each stroke showing where the knife had entered and lifted. He had copied the old label from the account book, but he had added what time had asked him to add. Harlan Daughters, soap boiled slow, Big Hill Road, Kentucky. The word daughters was plural and deeply cut. Lena ran her fingertips above the letters without touching them, the way she had once held her hand above the old letter before unfolding it. The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at the floor, pretending to examine a knot in the pine. "You spelled it right," she said. He swallowed. "I checked 3 times. I can tell." Sam helped with the hanging holes. "I can tell that too." Caleb glanced up, uncertain whether he had failed by needing help. Lena lifted the sign carefully. Good work often has more than one hand in it. They hung it that afternoon above the door, not high, not polished, level enough that Amos would have had no complaint if he had passed by. The black dog, older now around the muzzle, sat in the lane and watched with the patience of an original witness. When the sign settled onto its screws, the shed did not change. It became more fully what it had already been becoming. That evening, Lena began her own letter. She used heavy paper from Mrs. Price, who said every proper record deserved paper that could survive damp hands and foolish descendants. The candle stub from Eliza's package sat beside the page, unlit. The brass hydrometer lay in its case. The soap stamp rested near her wrist. Outside, late snow tapped the roof and melted without finding a seam. Lena wrote the first words slowly. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. Not because she had nothing to say, but because the old sentence was larger when held from the other side. She had once been the unknown one, the cold-handed one, the tired person with no certainty. Now her own hand rested on the page, and somewhere beyond her life, another person might come to this room, needing not a legend but instructions. She began again beneath the opening. "My name is Lena May Harlan. I found this place when I had less than $10, no room of my own, and no clear proof that the world had any use for me. I am writing so you will know that despair can be real and still not be the final authority. If you have opened what I have sealed, then you have already listened more carefully than the hurried world teaches people to listen." She paused and looked around the room. The fire breathed beneath the copper vat. The shelves held herbs, the floor held oil dark and light, the old wavy pane bent the walnut tree into a river of branches. The tin box was closed beneath the counter, not as a secret of wealth, but as a promise that beginnings should be kept for the one who needs them next. She wrote of the roof and the seam that wanted more overlap than a beginner expected. She wrote of lime mortar and the danger of making new work too hard for old brick. She wrote of sash cords, figure-8 knots, and the patience required by glazing putty in cold weather. She wrote of hickory ash and the nickel-sized egg test. Though the hydrometer was better, she wrote of the first batch that almost fooled her at false trace. She wrote of Sam, Mrs. Price, Amos, Doris, Caleb, the truck driver, the librarian, the guard at the station, all the small hands that had moved stones from the path. She did not write of revenge. There was none to tell. The plant manager who had withheld papers did not return to the story. The locked doors and unpaid wages remained wrong, but they did not deserve the final room in her house. Martin's keys, Annette's lowered window, the room emptied by sundown. Those things had shaped the road to Big Hill, but the shed had taught Lena that not every wound becomes a shrine. Some are acknowledged, then set outside where weather can reduce them. By midnight, the letter had reached 6 pages. She did not finish it. A letter meant for the future should be revised by more than one season. She folded the pages loosely and placed them in the new ledger, between the account of the first plain batch and the list of names waiting for soap. Near dawn, she stepped outside. The sign above the door was dark with damp. Snow lay in the carved letters and made them readable even before full light. Down by the road, the old county chain hung no longer between the posts. Lena had kept it coiled beside the shed, not as a barrier, but as a reminder of how some thresholds exist only until someone with a rightful key arrives. At the courthouse basement, Mrs. Price still kept the unclaimed dollar in her desk drawer. It had become a private joke between them, though neither woman treated it lightly. Once every few months, Lena stopped by with soap wrapped in brown paper, and Mrs. Price would open the drawer, lift the narrow envelope and say, "Still balancing." The bill remained flat, ordinary and patient, held between county receipts and a packet of peppermint candies. It was not needed now. That was why it mattered. It proved there had been a morning when $1 could not be given, and kindness found another shape. Years do not heal everything. They do, however, give careful work time to gather. The shed still stood off Big Hill Road in Madison County, Kentucky, beneath walnut limbs that had learned its roofline again. In summer, calendula grew near the back step. In autumn, hickory ash cooled in a covered barrel. In winter, smoke lifted straight from the repaired chimney when the air was still. The creek kept its narrow speech behind the building. telling stones what water had always known. Movement does not have to be hurried to arrive. Lena boiled soap in small batches. She cut after 48 hours. She cured for 6 weeks. She tied each bar in brown paper with cotton string and never made a crooked knot when she could help it. Some bars went to the cafe, some went by mail, some were given quietly to people whose hands had split from work, weather, illness, or worry. She did not become famous. She did not become rich. She became useful to a circle wide enough to matter and modest enough to remain human. On the mantel sat the brass key. Beside it lay the soap stamp, the hydrometer, the candle stub, and a walnut from the tree that guarded the flag. The leather book rested in a drawer lined with cloth. Eliza's letter was wrapped in linen, not hidden now, but protected. Lena's own unfinished letter waited beside it, gaining pages slowly as seasons taught her what instructions could not. The soap-boiling shed waits. It has always waited. Not for crowds, not for applause, not for a life made large enough to impress strangers. It waits the way useful places wait, with a roof that keeps rain out, a chimney that draws, a floor worn by honest steps, and tools laid where the next hand can find them. And in the county clerk's desk, beneath ledgers and peppermint wrappers, one unspent dollar still lies flat in its envelope, kept not because it can buy anything large, but because it remembers the exact morning when a young woman with cold hands walked in from the road and was given, at last, something that could not ask her to leave before sundown.